obviously Stuart Rhodes and leadership are directly aware of those, and they will have at times reached out and either pulled back those individuals and saying you're not going to do this as an official component of the Oath Keepers organization, or they will say some have said something to the effect of, let's do this in a limited capacity compared to what you were proposing or what you're doing now. So they will rebuke or sort of seek to control or guide the outcomes and actions of those individuals. And the reason I say semi-autonomous is that the organization as a whole is not structured to be a command and control framework in the sense that orders flow from on high. It's not one individual makes a declaration and everybody thus acts on that declaration, though that can't happen. People can respond to that. Instead, it is meant to be an ebb and flow between rank and file and leadership, because the concept here is that as all individuals within the organization are keepers of an oath, they each have the ability to and have been implored at times to raise circumstances that might be of interest to the broader entity's interests. And so what we often have seen in the history of the Oath Keepers is that individuals or state chapters will sort of lead the edge in terms of what the overall organization engages in, and then the national leadership or Rhodes will decide if that is appropriate. And a really good example of this is Muller Refuge standoff, where individuals associated with the organization chose to partake, even though Rhodes himself said to the Josephine County branch that was the nearest and the most responsive, we do not want to be present on the property itself. There was an individual that did take part in the refuge standoff as outside of the purview of Mr. Rhodes' approval, and he was subsequently split ways with the organization after the fact. But the Josephine County branch started to respond, but was basically said, please pull back and only stay at the parameter of the standoff, because, as Rhodes himself stated, we don't want another wave occur. So this is a good example of how the organization is semi-autonomous, in that some entities will act with a limited autonomy, but ultimately everything flows through Mr. Rhodes, who is the fulcrum of the organization writ large.
And you mentioned something about a national council. Are you referring to the board, or are you referring to a different group of people?
Yes, I'm referring to the board. Sorry, it was a poor choice of words.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly. So, at the national level, or let me back up and say, who is what individuals are involved at the national level?
Off the top of my head, I can't list all of them out. I'd have to refer to prior notes or other sourcing. But definitively, it is Mr. Rhodes himself and other members throughout the history of the organization have spent, I believe, a 36-month increment of time in leadership in that board in support of Mr. Rhodes. So, he did create that function and basically just respond and answer to what he desires the organization to do. So there's not a whole lot of independence or check on any other entity. It's sort of like a stamp of approval, if you will.
All right, and yeah, I wasn't asking for specific names, but at the national level, you're including Rhodes and the board members, is that it?
More or less, yes. Sometimes state chapters might raise to a level of what I consider to be the national apparatus based on what's happening at any given point in the history of the organization.
Okay. And as far as like the division of labor between the regional groups and the national level, can you describe that?
It really just depends on the individual makeup of those regional groups or what the national leadership, and Mr. Rhodes specifically, is looking to accomplish at any given point in the history of the organization. We've seen different ebbs and flows between priorities and interest and dynamics within regional spaces. Some are much more, or some regional affiliates are much more oriented towards just musters, which are collections of individuals coming together to do training or to meet up within a paramilitary or militia standpoint, just going to firing ranges. Others are much more involved in more what we consider hardcore paramilitary training, where they're conducting drills and small arms tactics at kill houses or other types of facilities that they've erected for the purposes of training against, in their minds, an enemy or a government action against their personage or those that they look to protect the government from.
Did the Oath Keepers have a communication network?
They do. It's a little different now than it was at its sort of onset or at its height. It's become quite limited in some capacities based on what it had at its apex. At its apex, it had its website, social media platforms, which were very heavily attended to by audiences. They had very robust presences on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. They have their own newsletter, and they have various other means of communication through email chains and blasts and things of that nature.
And who was responsible for managing the, and when I say who, like was it at the national level or the local level that the communication network was managed?
Generally at the national level.
In your work doing threat assessments, does trying to distinguish the actions of an organization versus the actions of individual members?
Yes.
And in your opinion, is it possible to distinguish the Oath Keepers from roads?
In my expert opinion, it is absolutely difficult, if not near impossible, to distinguish the broader activities of the organization from the leadership of Mr. Rhodes.
And why do you say that?
For numerous reasons. First and foremost, the organization, like I said before, Mr. Rhodes is the fulcrum of the organization. There are very few activities that occurred under the auspices of the organization that he wasn't aware of, either in an approving or disapproving manner. There's quite a number of examples of him providing critique of others that acted in a way that he didn't see fit, or that he wasn't necessarily endorsing in the capacity that they did. The Josephine County, as I said before, is a good one. Mr. Ritzheimer, the individual that partook in the Mueller Refuge standoff, is another example. Mr. Ritzheimer very famously ripped up his membership card on a YouTube video, and Mr. Rhodes put out his own YouTube video with others stating how he found this conduct to be unbecoming, and Mr. Ritzheimer was a criminal and couldn't be trusted, and it goes on from there. Generally speaking, though, Mr. Rhodes sets the tone for the organization, and in many capacities, he's led the charge, both physically in person at these events, both offline and online engagement, and has pulled back the organization, again, like I said, when individuals go beyond the confines of what he had hoped to see or what he felt was appropriate. So when we examine it at that level and as a whole, it becomes almost impossible to distinguish Mr. Rhodes' personage from the organization as a whole.
And if we look specifically to the events of January 6th, what was the degree of Rhodes' involvement in organizing and attending it?
From my evaluation of the evidence played out and against Mr. Rhodes, and the reporting on it in the public space, it is very extensive, his role in January 6th. He was involved in a considerable number of private chats, public statements ahead of time. The content that he described leading into the event made clear his intentions for months ahead of time. On that day, his intentions were very clear for that day. And when we look at the operational aspect, there's very little of that day's activities that he wasn't visibly privy to, in the sense that he was in the group chats of the leadership that was assembled for that day, and he had every ability to stop the actions as though he had in the past with the Josephine County branch, and instead proceeded along as if everything was okay.
So I know I jumped ahead to January 6th, but prior to January 6th, were there other examples of paramilitary activity or operations by the Oath Keepers?
I can't think of the full list off the top of my head, but there are a definite number of examples that we can point to. There were multiple mobilizations that resulted in standoffs with federal authorities, law enforcement authorities, and local law enforcement authorities, wherein Oath Keepers, both the request and the encouragement of Mr. Rhodes and the national overall apparatus of the organization, showed up armed with the intent and capability to forcibly resist the law enforcement officers present at that standoff. That happened multiple times throughout the group's organizational history. They have, in multiple times engaged in what I consider to be armed intimidatory behaviors at First Amendment protests, wherein they would effectively police the crowd by virtue of flanking protesters and saying, I'm here to, quote, defend you from law enforcement and the federal government and protect your rights. But in reality, those individuals in law enforcement are on the ground said they ended up just increasing the tensions and making it complicated for law enforcement to do their job to keep the overall situation under control. There's other extant data that shows that almost 24% of all events the Oath Keepers attended ended up violent, and that was higher than even the Proud Boys, who are consistently engaging in direct conflicts with Antifa and other opponents, which, as a researcher in this space, that tells us that it's not just a matter of how they mobilize or the reasons why they mobilize, it's that the overall activities that occur when they mobilize are more violent by almost 24% more than any other actor that's being measured. Additionally, we can see that their worldviews and beliefs often guide how they choose where to mobilize. In the March against Sharia, there was a number of activities in which were orchestrated across the United States in recent history, where the Oath Keepers felt that it was appropriate for them to attend these rallies or marches armed and then walk through neighborhoods to send a message that they wouldn't stand for quote-unquote Sharia in America. In reality, when we look at the definition of terrorism and political violence, this falls under the intimidation and intent to intimidate other populations with the threat of harm. There is no way else to perceive this information because they don't live there, they're not a part of that community, and when we evaluate that as the whole of their behaviors, we can see that as informing their overall activity. So to sum up, I would say that the history of the Oath Keepers is one in which they consistently mobilize against the federal government, their perceived enemies, real or fictitious, and offline, not just online. And I should add, too, that they have a history of making implicit statements of violence towards elected officials. They've done so throughout their history, whether it was pre-Mr. Trump, early times of their history, or post-Mr. Trump when they started to endorse him overall. But what we see is they make statements to the effect of, Governor Brown, if this is how you get a civil war, basically saying if you don't stop these policies, we'll be forced to act in a way that will be commensurate with a civil war activity. They've also made direct appeals to their followers to go and protest outside of offices of political figures, which is fine and dandy for most engagements, except that they often do so, again, armed and with the intent to intimidate those individuals. This carries through to the days of January 6th, where we see Kelly Meggs make a statement to Mr. Rhodes saying that we need to make those senators uncomfortable, they need to know our presence. And given the activities on that day, it's very hard to disassociate those statements and their history from the desire to affect political change using force.
Follow-up question. First of all, when you said that there was these mobilizations that occurred, how did the Oath Keepers decide when and where to mobilize?
Yes, so often it was done through calls to action. Those come out from the associated member chapters, where they might issue one up to the national that then promotes it or rejects it, and again that goes basically through Mr. Rhodes. Sometimes in some of their history, they've partnered with other organizations like the 3%ers to mobilize to protect recruitment centers, in their minds protecting them from Islamic jihadists based on a single incident that occurred. So they'll listen to other organizations. Typically, though, those would flow from Mr. Rhodes or from emails, either from his personal statement where he had signed his name Stewart, or on their Facebook social media type activities, or from their email blast.
Was that the case for the January 6th mobilization?
Yes, Mr. Rhodes engaged in a sustained campaign of public statements on social media, both those that he still retained after being deplatformed for violent behaviors, and those that he found through other avenues, such as Alex Jones's InfoWars show, making very clear statements that the nation was at a brink point, and that individuals must show up, imploring them to show up. On the show, this is what he states. They're saying that they would engage in activities that would take back the country from what was effectively described as a coup, and emails that the organization sent out. They were calling for, quote, patriots to come to D.C. to stand with Mr. Trump and to be present. And I don't recall the rest of the wording in that. I have to look back at it, but that is consistent with the statements he made prior in public.
And during these mobilizations, what was the general turnout of Oath Keepers members?
So it depends on which event. It ebbs and flows throughout their history. Without a doubt, we can say that January 6th was the largest of all of them. If you look at the individuals under the charges from the federal government at this point that are on trial now, but as well as those that are assembled that were either members, affiliated, or official members, and those that express sympathy wearing the branded items on their clothing. Basically, as Mr. Rose has said in the past, you don't have to be a full member to be a part of the Oath Keepers. You're still doing your part. So these individuals we often will include as part of that. So if you're wearing an Oath Keepers morale patch or some other form of identification, we'll include you in those numbers. And when we stack it up over time, generally speaking, there's approximately upwards to 50 individuals at any given event. But the challenge of this is that, despite there being a list that says 38,000 members of the Oath Keepers are the total, this is actually a bit of a misnomer because the overall numbers, what that's measuring is lifetime, right? What we know about organizations, specifically violent extremist organizations or anti-government ones, and this pertains to the Oath Keepers as well, is that over time, membership roll actually fluctuates. Certain events have inspired individuals to join, others to drop off, as we stated previously today and in our statements to the court. The incident of January 6th actually saw some individuals leave explicitly because it went too far in their estimation, because of the leadership of Mr. Rhodes and what those individuals engaged in on that day. So when we look at the overall, what is the numbers of these events, a small number is actually quite high when we look at violent extremist actors, particularly when we talk up to 50. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb in violent extremist and terrorism research is less than 1% of all members or associated individuals with an individual group are actually the ones who engage in any kind of violence or direct action. Less than 1%. So when we're talking about upwards of 50 people, we're actually saying that's actually a fairly high number. That's a pretty sustained rate of engagement. And over time, what we've seen with the Oath Keepers is that compared to different groups like the 3%ers or some localized militias, they outstrip them in terms of overall mobilization volume. And that is, again, the case on January 6th.
Can you explain how the concept of a quick reaction force has factored into the Oath Keepers mobilizations?
Yes. So the quick reaction force is a sustained element of the Oath Keepers and other Patriot Militia Movement groups' offline activities. It's generally seen as a sort of, if the right conditions emerge, it's there to provide them a means to act on their ideologically held notions of what resistance to, in their minds, an unlawful constitutional order or an unlawful action by the U.S. government. This gives them an opportunity to then act upon those stated goals of forcibly resisting the U.S. government. Sometimes this also translates down to state and local, but it's typically the federal. So when we talk about QRFs, the Quick Reaction Force, in the context of the Oath Keepers, my opinion as an expert on this and based on my research, the January 6th QRF stands out a bit because it is so deeply tied to the sustained pattern of statements and intent leading into that day. It makes it very clear, and statements made by Rhodes and others within the organization ahead of January 6th, they make very clear that arms were a factor in their calculus towards mobilizing that day and mobilizing others to come to the Capitol. Now, they weren't saying, everybody come and bring your weapons. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to have them available in the event they felt necessary or certain criteria were met for them to utilize, and they specifically point to certain conditions, such as the President Trump invoking the Insurrection Act, or an Antifa, or others start violently attacking Mr. Trump's supporters or others assembled that day.
And we already heard testimony of a number of the statements, but I just want you to explain, without going into them in much detail, which specific statements are you referring to?
Can you clarify a bit more what you're asking?
Yeah, of course. So you said that the presence of the QRF in Washington on January 6th was informed by statements that were made beforehand. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
And I'm just asking what specific statements you're referring to.
I don't recall the specific statements off the top of my head in terms of the exact wording.
No.
But
Yeah, sorry, I'm not asking you for the exact wording, but like which categories of statements or where were they posted, etc.
Understood. Yes, so the statements I'm referring to are those like Mr. Rhodes made on the InfoWars show, where he makes clear that forces might be necessary, or he feels it's necessary, because there is an active coup being undertaken by political opponents of the Oath Keepers and Mr. Rhodes. And therefore, the need to be able to take up arms that day is intertwined with his statements about mobilizing to the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Though I think in the email it actually says January 5th, so being there. But those are the types of statements I'm referring to when they make statements that we're already under an assault by unseen forces, by a coup. The deep state is acting against Mr. Trump. These types of statements are the ones that show the relevance of the QRF in terms of their need to use force. And he makes it clear that at various times, from about, I would say about 2020 or early 2020 onwards, that we're already in a civil war, and if Mr. Trump doesn't do, and when he refers to there as invoking the Insurrection Act, if Mr. Trump doesn't do his job, then we'll be forced to take matters into our own hands, as to paraphrase the quote he makes.
In the Oath Keepers mobilizations prior to January 6th, can you describe what was Rhodes' general risk tolerance in those operations?
Yeah, so Mr. Rhodes has always been very conservative compared to other leaders within the Patriot Militia movement. He's not as outspoken or as brazen as, say, Mr. Emmett Bundy or others that have been much more aggressive in the sense of wanting to take the so-called proverbial fight to the government. Mr. Bundy was the architect of the Mueller refuge standoff, and as I pointed out earlier, Mr. Rhodes was quite clear that he didn't see Oath Keepers needing to be in the refuge itself, but rather on the periphery of it. And that's this conservative approach to engagement, knowing full well that there are certain types of engagements that don't reflect well in the organization and the public eye, or might bring down law enforcement response in a way that he doesn't want. Or I should say didn't want. But another example of this is his personal and organizational, at his direction, engagement with the so-called Battle for Berkeley. It was a series of clashes and protests at Berkeley University in California, or University of Berkeley, I can't remember which way it goes, in California. And at that time, the goal, according to Rhodes, was to show that he was willing to stand up against perceived censorship of the First Amendment and individuals of conservative nature being able to speak on campus. He was very open about his presence there, talked about the need to push back against figures like Representative Maxine Waters and other types of figures that he saw as orchestrating these sort of censorship campaigns. That presence was very much maligned by a lot of individuals because there were a number of overtly neo-fascist organizations also mobilizing and also speaking similar rhetoric at those events. They also devolved into some physical confrontations. And if you look at the way Mr. Rhodes presents himself at that time, he's wearing a riot gear helmet, a bulletproof vest, I believe it was, and making very clear that he's anticipating violence to occur, and it doesn't shy away from it. It speaks to the fact that they might have to do what they need to do. A few months later, Mr. Rhodes pulls out of the United States. He doesn't show up, and he specifically cites the fact that racist organizations are going to be there, and he didn't want to be associated with them. This is another example of his recognition that certain groups mobilizing alongside of, or oath keepers being seen mobilizing alongside of them, don't play well for the organization, and they may not hold the same values. Oath Keepers is not a racist organization as a whole, though individuals may or may not have racist views within it, but they don't align themselves as such. This is one of those examples of him pulling back the organization in a conservative way. However, beginning in about 2016, he completely threw caution to the wind and started diving in with a much more direct and antagonistic worldview and statements to his own members about how Oath Keepers and individuals that are members of Oath Keepers should approach the U.S. government and approach the conditions of the politics of this country at the time. And he becomes much more involved in conspiracy theories that drive the notion that one should act against this deep state sort of set of actors that are trying to remove their rights. So he becomes far more aggressive, far more willing to engage in an intimidatory way, and that's what we see ultimately culminate on January 6th.
And finally, Mr. Kreiner, in your research, what is your understanding of what the purpose of the mobilization was on January 6th?
My estimation of the mobilization on January 6th was for the Oath Keepers, specifically Mr. Rhodes and those he was in direct contact with and planning for the day of, to disrupt the proper flow of transition of power between one president to the other, because they did not believe, and they made very clear, Mr. Rhodes did explicitly in the media, in his own materials, and on Alex Jones' show. When I say media, I mean legacy media, like news reporting and statements to the press, made very clear that they never were going to accept Mr. Biden's presidency as legitimate. He believed that the outcome of the election, even before the election had taken place, was rigged. That no matter what occurred that day, this was a leftist Democrat coup that was denying President Trump his due second term in basically in his mind. And so when I evaluate the actions of that day and the evidence that's come out and the guilty verdicts and pleas since, what I see is a set of individuals that have held many years of anti-government, anti-authority views, acted on them at numerous points throughout their history, at times with the intention and capability to carry out violence if certain conditions were met. Now seeing those conditions met, despite the fact that the events hadn't occurred, they still decided to move forward and carry out their personal political views through the use of their physical bodies, which is a form of force, to disrupt the flow of the lawful transition of power from one president to the other.
Thank you, Mr. Kreiner. I don't have anything more at this time.
Mr. Miller, ready for cross-examination?
Sure, please, sir. So, Mr. Kreiner, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
We meet again. So let's start with just the last comment, and then we'll kind of go in reverse order with some of this. You said that on January 6th, it culminated by people that had these anti-government views using their bodies to prevent the transition of presidential power. Now, isn't it true that they were all there because they thought, in part at least, that they'd be called up under the Insurrection Act as a federal militia?
While Mr. Rhodes and some of the Oath Keepers may have said that that was the case, they were very clearly still denying the reality that the presidential election had turned out opposite of their personal political views, and therefore were taking action, in my professional opinion and my research, they're taking action to disrupt that based on what they believe to be the truth and not based on what the outcomes of the elections actually showed.
Also, and again, of course, disruption of certain things by force doesn't necessarily mean overthrow of government. You'll grant me that, right?
In this regard, I would actually state that it does become equivalent to overthrowing the government, because if you disrupt the lawful transition of power between one president to the other, then you're disrupting the normal flow of the U.S. government. And what they were saying was that they weren't willing to accept Mr. Biden as legitimate even before the election. That type of predetermined mentality tells me that they would never have accepted a legitimate election, and as others might have seen it. And instead, they chose to act and plan for months ahead of time to make sure that that didn't occur. Therefore, it comes down to them basically saying, we will not allow, and we're going to make sure we take action. We will not allow Mr. Biden to take office because we do not believe he was lawfully elected.
So it's all about delay. I mean, that's what they're asking Vice President Pence to do. It was what they were trying to do on January 6th. It was all about delay for purposes to get to the bottom of the fraud, wrongly or rightly, that they perceived in the vote, right?
They may have stated that, sure, but the reality is that there were numerous court cases going on around the country that gave them legal opportunities to exercise that right of challenging the election's outcomes. It's happened for decades in this country, but the use of their personal bodies and paramilitary outfits, that is an entirely different and starkly different approach than just simply saying, we'd like to delay the proceedings to ensure we have the right accurate count.
Hey, look, we aren't commenting on whether it was right or wrong, okay? That's not the point of this question at all. I'm not saying, hey, were they out there, should have they been out there in paramilitary gear, should have they been trying to delay by force, none of that. But the issue is that they were there because they perceived that there was vote fraud. They had asked, a number of people, not just within Oath Keepers, but others, had asked Vice President Pence to delay the certification so that what they perceived and others perceived as vote fraud could be properly investigated. That's not permanent action, that's delay. That's the point that I'm trying to ask you about. How do you see their position as being one of permanency as opposed to delay for purposes of investigating vote fraud?
I don't see a difference. Seconds, minutes, hours, days, forever, the ability to disrupt the lawful transition of power when it's been stated for months on end that was happening, that was what should happen in their estimation, and then acting upon it is a form of political intimidation, and the threat of violence behind that with the QRF and their statements leading into the event, it becomes very clear that their goal was to disrupt the U.S. government, and they didn't want to allow it to occur.
When did President Biden take office?
Mr. Kreiner, can you hear anything that we're saying?
No, they're on. Can you go off record for a moment?
Yes, let's go off record and see. We'll back up.
I'm not the only one in the building having phone trouble.
It sounds like it might be a building wide issue.
Okay,
Please bear with us.
it's a building-wide issue.
Sign language?
Does anyone have an objection if I hold up a brief note just telling our witness to everyone that's on here essentially that we're having technical difficulties? And,
Your Honor, I sent them a 2-word text saying technical issues.
Thank you. I'm also, it's to the extent we can let Ms. Harrison or Mr. Flynn know that it's helpful as well.
would we do that allowed right now, either in the building? Test. Can you hear me? Are we live?
Mr. Reiner, can you hear us?
Yes.
Excellent, we're back.
All right, we're back on the record. We had a brief interruption. It sounded like the court's ability to dial out went down briefly, but we're back on. Mr. Reiner can hear us. Ms. Harrison, are you able to hear us as well?
Yes, I've got you back again. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, so, Ms. Miller, you had just asked about when President Biden had taken office. That was, unfortunately, I think everything passed when the question was asked. We lost the connection issue. So if you could just re-ask the question and then.
So just to refresh you, Mr. Kreiner, on the question that relates to delay, and I asked you when was President Biden inaugurated? When did he take office?
Oh, January 6, 2021. Or sorry, January 20, 2021. Pardon.
Right, 15 days after January 6th, right?
Correct, yes.
And in fact, again, every written communication from Stuart Rose to the Oath Keepers writ large after the election up until January 6th had to do with uncovering the vote fraud and making sure there was time to do so. Isn't that correct?
I can't speak to every communication, I'm sorry.
Well, that was the theme of every communication to the Oath Keepers writ large. I'm talking about the emails that were sent out. There are only a handful. You reviewed them, right?
Yes, I've reviewed the emails that I've seen. I have seen some of the emails. I may not have seen every single email that went out from the organization.
Yeah, at least as far as organization goes writ large, I mean, that really is the only mass communication that went out to Oath Keepers members was, look, we got vote fraud, we need to uncover it. We want to make sure that there's delays so that we can get it uncovered. There's nothing there about overthrowing the government, was there?
This wasn't the only thing they stated. There was a lot of content that he put out to the public, both through the mass legacy media, journalists that interviewed him, as well as his presence on InfoWars, and other forums. He made a lot of statements that went far beyond just talking about voter fraud, even if that was a core or pillared element of his communications to his membership. He was also very clear about the illegitimacy of Mr. Biden prior to and through all the way up until his inauguration.
And Mr. Kreiner, again, the question is about the organization at large, through email, through the website. I mean, you aren't submitting to the court that the 38,000 or whatever the membership was of the Oath Keepers all heard these interviews on Alex Jones or on legacy media. That's not your position, is it?
No, I'm not asserting that they all heard it. What I would assert, though, is that they all had the ability to hear it and that it was intended for them to hear.
And with respect to actually what happened on January 6th, there was some delay, right?
Delay for...
Delay in certification. How long was the delay in certification that took place on January 6th?
I don't recall off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, it was just a matter of hours, right? Or maybe minutes?
I don't recall a specific amount of time, though I do recall that they went back to proceedings on the floor of Congress later that day, that evening, I believe.
Well, isn't it true that it actually sped up the process, that they reached certification at an earlier date and time than what they otherwise would have?
To be quite frank, I'm not sure what a standard time frame for that would be, and that's not my specialty, and that's not really what I was asked to research and evaluate for this, so I'm not entirely sure how to answer the question.
So at the time the certification was occurring, I mean, you'll grant me that it occurred within just a short period of time after this January 6th riot, right?
Sure, yes, it occurred within a short period of time.
Right, and the reason why this is important is because you're telling this court, through your opinion, that the reason those guns were there in Virginia was because the Oath Keepers wanted to overthrow the government. So those guns were still there at the time the certification occurred to the president, right?
I don't know the time frame of the physical location of those firearms. I don't have that information. What I can say, though, is that what you just stated about my assertion is not fully correct. I'm not making an attribution of the firearms being there in any regard towards the permanence of the disruption. The reality is that they had them there for the express purpose of being able to use them and had planned to use them if certain conditions were met in their estimation.
And the stated conditions for using those firearms was that Oath Keepers was called up as a militia under the Insurrection Act, isn't that true?
That is one component of that is correct.
Well, it's the only written component that was given to the Oath Keepers at large.
They were also very clear that throughout the history of the organization, they're very clear that the use of firearms is not solely against the U.S. government, which is what this would have been if we're being very transparent about what the firearms were being used for.
Oh, okay, so
Because I'm not really sure who the opponent would be other than the U.S. government, as well as the individuals who might have used them against fashion.
All right, Mr. Craddock, so what was your question specifically?
So the question is the purpose of use of the firearms, or the written statement about the use of those firearms to the Oath Keepers at large.
And so, Mr. Craddock, the question is, are there other written reasons, or is that the only written reason for the use of the firearms?
We're having connectivity issues throughout the television. We're off, or with the phone, we're off the record for just a second. They're speaking with IT about it, Your Honor. There's a lot of email going around.
So it sounds like, just pass on the parties, it sounds like there's continuing issues with the phone. IT is working on it. We're aware of it, trying to fix. All right, we're back on record. Mr. Craddock, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right, so we'll loop back around. Mr. Miller has been asking a question about written statements in relation to QRF, so let's focus on that. Just ask the question.
All right, did you hear the judge's last question, Mr. Kreiner? Rephrased.
Only partially. It cut out.
All right, yeah, let me just ask it for you then. The specific question was written communications to the Oath Keepers writ large, in other words, to the membership, stating any purpose for those firearms in Virginia for any other reason than the Insurrection Act.
I cannot recall every detail of those at this time, so I can't say that there was additional context provided to the membership.
Well, how many communications to the Oath Keepers writ large were there from November, say the election in November until January 6th?
I don't have a firm count on that.
Well, I mean, you're the guy that's reviewed all the documents, and I'm not trying to be argumentative. You've reviewed thousands of them, granted, but the most important documents are those that relate to that time period between November, say, 3rd and January 6th, aren't they?
I would agree that those are the most important documents in terms of context of January 6th, yes.
And you can't give the court an understanding of the number of communications to the Oath Keepers membership at large from Stuart Rhodes?
I'm just stating that I don't have a firm number right now. I didn't have that perhaps or part of the research as wasn't to tabulate the number of total.
Isn't it true it's 2 or 3?
That sounds about correct, yes.
And none of those 2 or 3 communications say anything about using firearms for purposes of overthrow the government, right?
Again, I can't recall everything that those statements or those emails or communications have explicitly stated, so I'd have to review them. At this time, I can't pull that off the top of my head.
And none of the communications to the membership of the Oath Keepers at large expressly stated anywhere that the Oath Keepers or Stuart Rhodes wished to overthrow the government.
Sorry, was there a question?
That is a question.
Apologies, I didn't hear a question. In terms of if you're asking a question of if there were such a, I don't recall seeing the word overthrow, but I don't believe that that's necessarily the metric by which they would communicate that. That's not really their style of communicating insinuations or desires of action against the U.S. government.
But you understand, of course, that the way your opinion is being used is to apply basically the actions of, say, 50 to 60 Oath Keepers and Stuart Rhodes against the organization as a whole, which by some estimates includes 38,000 members, right?
I do understand that, and I also understand that the organization's bylaws also talk about that individuals are representative of the whole of the organization reflect back on it. So I think it's a fair estimation to make that the leader of the organization and founder and president for life should be the metric by which we evaluate the organization's behaviors overall.
Well, you also understand that the bylaws say that the individual acts of individuals in the organization are their own responsibility, right?
I do understand that, and I also recognize that the statement in which it precedes that is that they reflect on the organization. So there's an acknowledgement from the organization that what members do is a representation of the organization.
So it's your position that if one member does something that's extreme, that it's the duty or obligation of the remainder of the members to disassociate themselves from the group, even though their bylaws may provide for a totally different governance of the organization.
I go based on my estimations are based, my analysis and my conclusions are based on the way that they frame and provide their own desired approach to these situations. The history of their engagement with their members that have gone awry from what they want is actually fairly inconsistent. So in terms of evaluating them overall, what we can see is that the organization does not have a consistent pattern of dealing with what they may deem acceptable or unacceptable activities within the offices of its membership, but ultimately that flows back up to Mr. Rhodes. And so if Mr. Rhodes is the arbiter of that decision-making, my professional assessment of this is his behaviors then become the epitome and guidepost for how the rest of the organization should be viewed.
Right, so if he's no longer in charge of the organization, then the organization takes on a different character, doesn't it?
That is the way of most organizations, yes.
So if he's incarcerated, no longer able to govern the organization, that might be one aspect of changing the character of the organization?
No, I don't think that's the case for the Oath Keepers. He hasn't relinquished control in a public way or even communicated that to his membership. And per the bylaws and per his own statements, he is president for life, and therefore until he relinquishes or is removed under incompetence by others within the organization, the board, there's no way to make that assertion that you just provided.
Okay, but I mean, if somehow he is removed from leadership, you'll at least grant me that Oath Keepers no longer are basically conflated with Stuart Rhodes.
to use some of their own languages and some of the members that dissociated themselves from the organization, it would still be a stain on the reputation of the organization because of the engagement that they had on January 6th. And this is why the North Carolina chapter removed itself from the national apparatus. And quite frankly, the legacy of the organization is tied intrinsically to Mr. Rhodes and his actions and beliefs and leadership. To say that it wouldn't still be a factor, even if he were to be found incompetent, would take quite a number of other variables to change my assessment.
So if he is no longer the leader of Oath Keepers, and the Oath Keepers have a series of bylaws that make provision for complying with the law and requiring that members not move or do action to overthrow the government, you're saying that that doesn't matter. It's still an organization that advocates by force or violence to overthrow the government.
In my professional assessment, until such time as the organization makes an explicit statement disavowing the actions that day, changing the charter itself, and stating full on that there are no longer permitted to have these members within it, much like the North Carolina chapter did, much like the 3%ers did when it dissolved because of January 6th, I cannot, in a professional capacity, say that the organization would have lost its endorsement of what occurred that day. Individuals that have remained figures in this organization after the fact, members and leadership figures, have not disavowed what occurred. In fact, they've even doubled down on it, saying that it was the appropriate course of action, and the worldviews that they hold and the conspiracies they espouse make very clear that that is a persistent view, and therefore, if they're still members, it's still a factor of the organization.
So when 99% of the organization did not participate in what happened in Washington, D.C., you don't think that 99% reflects upon the organization itself?
I think it does very heavily, but I think it reflects in a way different than what you might be portraying it, because as I've stated before, specific individuals and chapters made very clear their disgust at what occurred that day and made strident efforts to explicitly and publicly dissociate and distance themselves from those actions.
So,
the North Carolina chapter was very clear in its leadership's decision unanimously to remove themselves from the broader apparatus of the Oath Keepers because they stood outside of the Capitol on that day, watched what occurred, and said, this is a bridge too far. Anyone else that hasn't yet done that is tacitly, at minimum, tacitly endorsing those activities, and at maximum may continue to want it to be a part of the organization's identity.
So you've got to actively go out and basically give a certification that because there were, I think by my calculation, assuming that we have 38,000 members, 1/700th of the organization involved in protests, some unlawfully in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, that they should be painted with the same brush as those individuals, that are part of an organization seeking to use force against the government.
Objection asked to answer.
I'll ask a little. Mr. Kreiner, did you hear the question?
Yes, sorry, I thought we weren't moving forward. My apologies. Should I answer the question?
Yes, you can answer the question.
Okay. The basis of the question is flawed in the sense that it effectively asks us to reject the organization's own understanding of its membership's actions reflecting on its conduct and its reputation. It's very clear within its own bylaws and within its own communications to its members that this is the way they view individual and collective action on behalf of those that are a member of the entity. If we look at the history of the organization as well, it's very clear when the organization feels someone has gone too far or the actions of another don't fit within the paradigm of what they accept, they make it known. And given the way that the individual chapters or individuals that have disassociated since January 6th have publicly done so, I don't think it's too far to say that individuals that remain in the organization are tacitly endorsing that action on January 6th.
And so of the 37,500 or whatever it was that weren't present in Washington, D.C. on January 6th of the Oath Keepers, if they have not been informed about what the organization is doing, or strike that. Let me ask you about the Arizona chapter. You're aware that it is also disassociated itself from the national organization?
Yes.
And there are a number of individual oath keepers who have done the same?
Yes, I'm not aware of the full comprehensive list, but I am aware that that is the facts.
So even though they remain members and they've condemned the actions of the organization, do you still regard them to be members of an organization that advocates by force or violence for the overthrow of government?
By definition, if they remain members, then they're still members of an organization, irrespective of what its advocation is or not.
Well, Arizona, that chapter, as well as even North Carolina, are still oath keepers, correct?
Kind of. No, Oath Keepers North Carolina removed itself from the national apparatus but kept the brand or narrative construct. They made a clear break from the organization. In terms of how Arizona broke apart, I actually don't recall off the top of my head precisely what their language was, so I'd have to reevaluate that to answer that question clearly.
Well, really the only thing they did is they made a statement that separated themselves from the actions that occurred on January 6th. And that really is the critical point in your mind, is that right?
Objection, assumes facts.
Can you rephrase it to at least see if you understand the facts as you're stating them?
Right. So, I mean, you said North Carolina disassociated themselves. How did they do it?
From my recollection and reviewing the reporting on it and the statements made by the organization was that they collectively agreed to remove themselves, so they must have concurred in some sort of meeting or functionality there, and then made a public statement to that effect.
And Arizona?
I don't recall how Arizona did. I haven't focused too heavily in on Arizona post January 6th.
Florida?
Again, same answer.
So even though a member, and again, we're talking about this kind of broad membership list that, I mean, the number's a little amorphous. You testified to the leak or the hack, whatever you want to call it, that reflected 38,000 members. I mean, you'll grant me that we have tens of thousands of members of Oath Keepers today, right?
I don't have a firm estimation on that, though. I would say that it is likely that there's more than 10,000 individuals that are self-described members of Oath Keepers.
And well, let me ask you this: have you had an opportunity to evaluate in any way the involvement of Representative Eastman in Oath Keepers?
Only by virtue of what's made publicly available and discovery.
Right, and you've seen the limited number of emails he's received from Oath Keepers since 2010?
Yes.
Less than one a year, at about a fair assessment?
I don't recall the exact number.
So for these individuals that have received very limited email communications from the national organization, I mean, you'll grant that Representative Eastman's a member of the Alaska chapter, right?
I wasn't aware that there was an official Alaska chapter, but I know that he's a member of the organization.
So for these individuals that receive limited communications from Oath Keepers, although of course now we have public knowledge of some of the things that have been alleged about their involvement as well as the indictments, but do you believe that they should be painted with the same broad brush as the 50 to 60 that were present in Washington, D.C. on January 6th?
Objection, vague.
How so?
I don't know what painted with the same broad brush. It could mean anything.
What are you asking Mr. Kreiner to tell you?
So Mr. Kreiner is a smart guy. I mean, he understands I'm asking about basically the blameworthiness of the 50 to 60 that were in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. This whole approach is designed to ensure that others also are responsible for their acts or somehow connected with their acts. I think probably Mr. Kreiner understands that, but if he doesn't, I can certainly rephrase the question.
Where I think it's appropriate to rephrase it is the paint with a broad brush, because he's here as an expert to render an opinion on, as stated by the plaintiffs here, about whether or not the Oath Keepers are an organization, and then based on the background research that he's given, right? The question about whether or not people who were present versus those that were there is really more of a policy and slash moral question as how you're asking it. It's really outside the scope of what an expert could testify to. So to the extent that you can rephrase the question to focus on what you said in the second part, I think that would be more appropriate.
Well, and Judge, I think I'm just going to strike the whole thing and focus on a related question. So if I may proceed. So, Mr. Kreiner, let's just focus on the folk that were present in Washington, D.C. I think you said, I think your number was 50. I've heard 50 to 60. It's somewhere around that number that were present on or about January 6th that were affiliated with Oath Keepers, right?
In the city that day, I would estimate it approximately 50.
Okay, and then of those, I think 33 were charged, some of which have subsequently been convicted of crimes arising out of their actions on January 6th.
That number sounds correct. I'd have to review for the exact number, though.
And I think your testimony was that in all of these other events that Oath Keepers have participated in, under the direction of Stuart Rhodes, across the country that you're aware of, there have been about 50 people from Oath Keepers participating, correct?
Up to 50.
And certainly, the run-of-the-mill membership of Oath Keepers, given the limited communication that's coming out of national, as you put it, aren't going to be aware of all of those actions, activities, and communications that occur within that small group, right?
Objection, close to speculation.
Overruled, you can answer the question if you know.
I can't say to any extent what any one individual has awareness of.
Well, I mean, you've reviewed a repository of tens of thousands of documents relating to Oath Keepers, and I assume that's every accessible email that Oath Keepers has ever sent out to its membership, right?
I wouldn't say every. That's quite a number of emails. I would say that I've reviewed a number of them throughout my research time, yes.
And you're aware that the primary mode of communication, at least on January 6th, was this closed signal chat group. You're aware of that, right?
Yes, I'm aware of the signal chats.
Right, and that's how most of the communication occurred within the small group of 50 people on Capitol Hill on January 6th and before.
I believe it's correct that was primarily how they communicated, though I'd have to review documents to know for certain, or to agree with that fully.
But at least it wasn't communications that were made writ large to the organization, right?
In terms of what they were talking about day of as events were unfolding, no, they were sending out mass emails at that time, correct?
Right, so, I mean, what the average everyday member, like, for example, Representative David Eastman would have, is an occasional email, maybe once a year, from the organization. And then if there's some sort of cult of personality where they want to follow Stuart Rhodes, they might catch an article in the news about him, but that really is the only methodology of communicating these more extreme elements of Oath Keepers that you testified to, right?
You know, I think there's a couple of components of that aren't fully accurate. First and foremost, that there is a number of vectors in which information is pushed out to those that might be members or adherents of the Oath Keepers overall, or interested and not interested. This stuff filters out. Just saying that just their emails is the only way they receive primary communications, or is the only way they'd be aware of. I mean, that's not true. They had a forum. Mr. Eastman was a part of that forum. You know, there's engagement in a lot of different ways that's both tacit and active by members. So if we're talking writ large, I would actually disagree and say that, you know, there's a number of vectors by which they would receive communications from the organization, and did receive communications, and a number of avenues from which Mr. Rhodes and other members of the Oath Keepers pushed out information and views and desires for the organizational trajectory.
All right, so I've heard emails and I've heard a forum. What else was pushed out to the group at large?
Well, as they testified to earlier, you know, he was engaging on a number of different media outlet type presences, whether it was legacy media or himself present at events speaking, or through platforms such as Alex Jones's webcast, the InfoWars cast. These are just three primary examples in which he was most prolific in.
Right.
But there's also social media.
Sir, I'm asking about communication to the group, okay? Not just generic communications to the media that might be heard by the public at large. I'm asking about communications to the group itself. Anything besides the forum and emails? Anything at all?
So I think the disconnect here is when you say the group, you know, as Mr. Rhodes has said himself, you don't have to be a full-fledged member on an email chain in order to be considered a part of Oath Keepers. And so when he speaks as the tone setter and the leader of the organization, that is effectively the same in my professional estimation as sending out a formal email from their listserv or posting on their website.
So you can be an Oath Keeper and not sign up for Oath Keepers. In other words, just by your actions, you can be an Oath Keeper, is that right?
According to Mr. Rhodes, and based on individual actions and approaches to the organization, the barrier of entry is that low, that one could simply put on a patch and say, I am an Oath Keeper, and therefore I am associated with the entity. This is not just my estimation, this is as Mr. Rhodes himself has put out in the past.
Sounds like to me there's kind of separate categories of Oath Keepers. You have kind of the group at large that, take the oath, that have the membership bylaws that they understand they're following. You have kind of an inner circle group, the 50 or so that accompanied Stuart Rhodes to these events in Ferguson, Oregon, the Bundy Ranch, January 6th. And then you've got even another category of those that informally associate with the group. Was that a fair characterization that you've got different types of membership within the Oath Keepers?
I think you got it about 85% correct. The one thing I would disagree with there is that the 50 or so is not a single core entity. And in fact, over time with the organization, those that mobilize alongside or from within in terms of formal membership, if you will, rotates. So it ebbs and flows who those individuals are, what chapters, the extent to which they associate and involve themselves. It depends on what the individual mobilization point would be in terms of what event they're going towards, the call of action. So what I'm basically saying here is, in terms of a typology, a framework for understanding membership, you do have a formal or a sort of official, those that have served, then you have the associate, those that haven't served but still take an oath that's administered by those that have served. And then you have these sort of informal members or those that self-identify with the organization, and then that core mobilization space can draw on any of those at any given time. And Mr. Rhodes and other leaders, and I mean leaders, not just national leaders on the state and other levels, have accepted that and have encouraged individuals to associate and involve themselves that way.
So this core group 50, I mean, you aren't saying that they're exactly the same individuals for each of the events, say Ferguson, Oregon, National Refuge there, the Bundy Ranch standoff, but you would grant that there is significant overlap of individuals participating in each one of those events, right?
I actually don't know the exact composition of every one of those individuals at every single one of those events. It would be very nearly impossible to actually make that estimation. It'd probably take me my entire career to verify every single name at every single mobilization. What I am saying though is that those that mobilize offline with the organization throughout its history is a hodgepodge of individuals. It's not the same individuals every single time, which in a couple different ways can be both a damning effect when you look at it from the lens of January 6th and understanding their mobilizations to violence, but it can also just be a benign element of organizational dynamics writ large of any type when we're talking about political protest or violent extremist activity. This is a fairly consistent dynamic we see across the board.
And it's this offline organization that poses the greatest risk, right?
Can you clarify what you mean by risk? Like what?
Well, I mean, you're in the business of evaluating risk, right? Evaluating domestic violent extremist groups. You aren't concerned, well, let me just strike that question for a minute. Is that core group that is committing the acts that we saw on January 6th, that's involved in other confrontation like in Ferguson, that's involved in the Bundy Ranch confrontation, that's involved in Oregon, it's that group that you're concerned about when you state that you're concerned about the use of violence toward government. You aren't referring to the group at large, members like Representative David Eastman.
What I'm stating in two parts here is first, the individuals that mobilize are not the same individuals. So the reference there to the same 50 or the 50 is mischaracterizing what I'm trying to assert here in a little context around that. Is that, again, it's rotating based on conditions and individuals that choose to associate or might have in the past involved themselves in those events. The second part of it, in terms of how it pertains to the rest of the membership and my assessment of the group, if one is a member, one falls into the auspice of my assessment of the group. I don't make distinctions when I talk about group level threats and risks. based on particular individuals unless that is a relevant ask. And in the case of something like the organization of the Oath Keepers, when one is very clearly self-identifying, doubles down on membership, and engages in something at the level of a lifetime membership, I consider that to be a dedicated ideologue within that space. Whether or not that means that translates to an act of violence for that individual is endemic to the threat assessment of that individual.
A dedicated ideologue in 2009 that makes a lifetime donation somehow is painted with, or I guess should be ascribed, the viewpoints that were expressed on January 6, 2021? Is that what I hear you saying?
Can you repeat the question? It kind of crackled a bit.
Yeah, I mean, you said that somebody that's a lifetime member, they're reflective, I guess they're held to a higher standard from your perspective, and being responsible for the views that have been expressed by, say, the leadership, Stuart Rhodes. I'm paraphrasing it, but isn't that what you're saying?
When I refer to that, the concept of an individual as a lifetime member and my assessment of their role within the organization from an ideological standpoint or from an association standpoint, what I'm looking at is a repeated pattern of behavior. Is it a one-off association because that was one of only two options at the time and it made more sense financially to just pay the extra $50 or whatever it was? Or is it I chose this route because this is more in line with my identification, beliefs, and desires in terms of what I would want to get out of that association. The characterization you made here of the lifetime membership, it wasn't a one-time purchase. There was an attempt to reestablish that status once it was errantly, per the emails that were provided, dropped. And so what we're seeing is not just a casual decision to be a lifetime member, but a desire to be persistently labeled as such and viewed as such, because when I would look at that as a professional, I say this is someone that is not just a casual member. This is someone that is a dedicated ideologue in terms of that organization. Now, this would be the same assessment I'd have of anyone in any organization that is holding violent extremist views or insurrectionary or any kind of anti-government, anti-authority space. So I don't want to limit this just to Mr. Eastman's involvement. I want to make it very clear this is a professional assessment I would apply to any type of organization of this nature.
So I want to get this straight. You looked at the emails, so I know what emails you're talking about. You're talking about the 2010 emails between Mr. Eastman and Oath Keepers, where he paid on a monthly basis his lifetime membership. And then he received an email, I think in 2011, saying, you need to pay more, and he said, oh no, I've already paid for my lifetime membership. Is that what you're referring to?
Your Honor, I'm going to object at this point because I think this has now gone well beyond the scope of direct. We didn't ask Mr. Kreiner to provide any opinions on any individual members of the Oath Keepers. We asked him to provide an opinion on the group as a whole. So for that reason, I think it's well beyond direct.
So, Your Honor, I mean, clearly, we have established, I'm 85% correct, that there are three different separate categories of membership. And I'm exploring that as part of what we're dealing with this lifetime membership and his statements regarding the emails that he has relied on and saying that somebody that purchases a lifetime membership should be more closely, I guess, entwined with the ideology of the founder.
I do find that he's an expert in this. I do find the testimony helpful to making my decision here, so I'm going to allow more questions.
Thank you, Your Honor. So again, are those the emails we're talking about, the 2010, 2011 email train that my client disclosed in discovery?
So I would need to review the exact emails again, because I don't believe that from my recollection, the way that you're describing it is precisely how I recall it in terms of the dynamics. So I would request that we would look at that before I answer the question any further.
Well, I'll just ask you then, without looking at the emails themselves, you remember that there were a series of emails that Mr. Eastman received from the Oath Keepers verifying that he had made monthly payments toward his lifetime membership, right?
I do recall that there were emails that confirmed his payment receipt, yes, but those were automated emails from I believe it was PayPal service.
Right.
Well,
but again, reflecting a monthly payment plan for the lifetime membership at the outset of the organization, I think in David's case, Representative Eastman's case, 2010.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
You confirm, I mean, in your memory, that those emails were from 2010.
I don't recall the exact year. I just recall the persistent presence of payment receipts, and I think they totaled up to approximately $1,000.
And well in advance of, as you described it, kind of the radicalization of the organization in 2016.
Again, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well before the radicalization of Oath Keepers sometime in 2016, 2017.
Again, are you asking a specific question there?
You said
I feel like
you said the Oath Keepers changed, 2016, 2017.
Correct, yes. That's my assessment, is that around 2016, 2017, Mr. Rhodes set a new tone for the organization.
Am I mischaracterizing it by calling it, by putting words in your mouth, by saying that you characterize that as a radicalization? Is that an appropriate description or not?
Organizations don't radicalize, individuals radicalize.
Okay, so with respect to the emails that you reviewed from Representative Eastman, they all predated that period, right?
Again, I don't recall the exact dates of it. I'd have to review.
Okay, well, assume for sake of argument that we're dealing with somebody that made a lifetime membership donation at the beginning of the organization, and then just sent back a perfunctory email saying, when asked for more money, I've already paid for my lifetime membership. How does that reflect that that individual has a higher level of perhaps correlation with the founder's radical ideology?
So I'm not making the assessment that his inquiry about payment status correlates or even is associated with a level of ideological outlook. What I'm saying is the decision to choose the pathway of lifetime member from the outset shows, in my estimation, of these types of engagements with these types of groups, again, not just Mr. Eastman's association, but writ large, choosing the highest level or the deepest level of association puts one more closely aligned ideologically with that group. And we've seen this bear out over time. That's deepened, and my assessment on that is deepened when a repeated pattern of behavior emerges wherein that individual or set of individuals even chooses to re-up when there's an error or when there's been a miscommunication about that, seeking to clarify and reassert that, no, I am a lifetime member and I want to be perceived and treated as such. That type of reiteration over a sustained period of time does indeed correlate to a higher ideological association with the organization writ large, not necessarily to Mr. Rhodes specifically, even though he does set the tone for the organization.
Okay, so I thought the organization radicalized in 2016, 2017. I think that's your testimony. So if these donations were made before then, how does that reflect a certain affinity for what you're expressing currently are Mr. Rhodes' radical ideas?
So again, organizations don't radicalize, individuals do. Organizations can shift tones and adopt worldviews based on the views of their leaders, and you can evaluate the tone or the radicalization levels of individuals throughout the entity as a whole and make that assessment. But what I'm not saying is that in 2016, the whole organization radicalized. What I've stated over time, that starting in approximately 2016, the Oath Keepers organization shifted its worldview predominantly away from one and that looked at the government as a potential aggressor and as an active aggressor, and therefore matched that tone of aggression and changed their status quo to be much more aggressive towards the U.S. government, both rhetorically and behaviorally, and began to shift the way that they engaged within society and against the U.S. government from that point on. The adoption of Mr. Rhodes' conspiratorial views that align with the QAnon conspiracy theory or that align with other sort of deep state conspiracy theories, or his understanding of the broader threat from what he perceived to be the greatest threat to America of Marxism, socialism, Antifa, those types of things, these dictated what happened with the organization. His shift to that and his promotion of Mr. Trump specifically was a departure from their past behaviors and outlooks. That is what I'm referring to when I say that organization changed starting in 2016.
And that affiliation with Trump was particularly dangerous in your view?
I don't have a particular view at all on whether or not association with Mr. Trump is dangerous or not.
Well, let me ask you just generally about the organization. At the time that David joined, I mean, he has the bylaws. The bylaws haven't changed since the organization started back in 2009, have they?
I'm not sure if they changed or not, to be completely honest with you.
You don't have any knowledge that they have?
I don't have any knowledge that they changed.
Right, and again, well, let me strike that. You saw the list, the code of conduct of the organization and the list of the rules that members are required not to obey.
At some point in my research on your group, I have looked at it, but I couldn't recall it off the top of my head.
And I guess, I don't want to mischaracterize your testimony, but as I understand it, you find that if an individual has the discretion to interpret whether or not something is constitutional, if they have the individual discretion to do that, that that's a dangerous thing.
I wouldn't tie those things together in terms of the way that you're constructing it under the auspices of the organization. When I talk to the individual interpretation of the Constitution, that's separate from their. That's more looking at the worldviews and outlooks of those and their understanding of the political systems. While that may inform their association with the organization, it's not intrinsically. It's not like we don't say like, okay, XYZ person is under oath keepers, therefore they now believe that they have the right to interpret the Constitution individually. These are kind of separate areas overall.
And I think, sir, you aren't answering my question because you're anticipating that I'm asking something that I'm not. And I get that. But let me ask it again. Do you see anything, just I'm saying isolated from anything else, an individual interpreting for himself or herself whether or not a particular act is constitutional?
Do I see anything about, sorry, I'm not seeing the full question.
Anything dangerous? Or I mean,
Oh,
if you
anything
can't answer
dangerous?
that, I'll ask you a different question.
Well, I think you can answer that question. I think you understand.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
I just didn't hear the anything dangerous part, my apologies. There is danger in individuals in certain capacities and in certain roles in our society believing that they have the right to interpret the Constitution in independent or in contradiction to the judicial system or to the legislative system.
Well, that's
There are
what I said.
conditions around.
I'm asking
Judge, you
individually,
can finish.
that individual.
Hold on, Mr. Will, hold on. I think he does understand your question. If it's not exactly, let's let him finish the answer here, and you can ask a follow-up if it's not exactly.
And I'm sorry, Your Honor, I'm just trying to expedite things a little bit because the way this is going, we're going to be here all afternoon.
I understand. I appreciate that. Let's let him finish the answer. Mr. Craddock?
In certain conditions, individual interpretation of the Constitution runs afoul of the directives and constitutional duties of those persons, depending on the role that they hold. So in certain aspects, the question you ask about, does individual interpretation of the Constitution pose a danger? Yes. In a benign sense of an average American just sitting in their home reading the Constitution and deciding this is how I interpret XYZ amendment, this is how I interpret XYZ political philosophy or ideology that stems from the creation or the acting upon those things, no, I don't think that that's danger inherently.
So, say law enforcement making the decision for himself or herself, dangerous?
In terms of what is and isn't constitutional?
Yes.
It depends on what we're talking about when we say danger. Are we talking about danger to themselves or to others, the organization?
Well, let's just talk about if you have somebody that believes that way and they're in a position of law enforcement, do you think that poses a risk to public safety?
If individuals within law enforcement are taking upon themselves to decide what is and isn't lawful in terms of the Constitution, I think in certain circumstances that can be dangerous to public safety.
Well, you know that all laws have to be interpreted to some extent, right?
I can't speak to the legality of or the extent of all laws or not.
Well, you understand that the Nuremberg trials dealt with the very question about whether or not somebody at a lower level in the military who receives an order has the obligation to follow that order, or rather should be concerned about a higher law, not necessarily the Constitution in the part of those that were being tried. But you understand that concept, right?
I understand the concept and the premise in which the Nuremberg trials were conducted. What I would point out, though, is that that is in a different jurisdiction entirely. It was under the context of a post-war environment, and wherein the former occupants of those lands, illegal occupants, were a warring party. In the United States, an individual choosing to engage in their own interpretation of law as it pertains to the role they hold as a sworn public servant is dangerous in some contexts, particularly when we're talking about whether or not that might hold someone else's life in jeopardy. And I would also point out that most of those individuals have defined pathways within their organizations respective of how they can deconflict those disagreements of how those laws should be conducted and not. In fact, when we look at the history of the Order Keepers organization overall, their active association and recruitment within those active spaces poses a direct threat to those organizations to public safety, because what they're basically saying is there is a parallel structure to which they think that they're beholden more so than necessarily the organization in which they're occurring and taking that oath. Therefore, they stand in direct contradiction to the lawful permissions they've been granted. If we're talking law enforcement, military, or otherwise, basically what they're saying is, I don't answer to the public anymore, and then therefore I can decide how the public should be treated, whether that's lethally or not.
Right.
That is a danger.
And in fact, their position is that they should answer to their superiors, right? If their superiors tell them something is right to do, they should follow that and not use their own discretion in the case that they believe the Constitution disallows that action to disobey that order.
What I'm stating is that within every role, and as someone that's held a role that has clear parameters and guidelines that are governed by ethics and duty, I can very clearly state that there are pathways to remedy disagreements and objections to granted order or given orders or given declarations of conduct. That does not translate into the individual having the sovereign right to overrule any and all other person's statement just because they simply feel that they don't like it.
Why do we even have an oath to the Constitution?
I couldn't tell you that.
It's a good break point.
Fair enough. All right, we have been going about an hour and a half. We'll take a break, come back at 2:45. Standard.
Okay, we're in part 2 of day 3. Thank you guys all for being here today. Please make sure to like and share this video. I'm going to step out here for just a minute and take a small break myself. I didn't quite get a chance during my lunch break to be able to finish everything I needed to do. So please take a moment again to like, share this video. We will be back here in 15 minutes from now. Thanks.
kids are not.
The kids are coming in, like, so,
I asked that during his deposition. He's gonna say he did.
yeah, I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, none of them is open to questions, though. I mean, I appreciate it, I'm not trying to, hey, send them all to me, okay? Yeah. Okay, well, that's good. And we'll ask him that.
Yep.
Will you text John and say he's testifying tomorrow?
It's all being broadcast live.
I'm so sorry. Your voice was hot. You didn't help me hear. Just don't go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry. Would you let John know?
Why you doesn't know?
I figured you would say hi. Oh.
if you're just joining us out there right now, if you haven't liked and shared this video, please take a moment and do that right now. We are in part 2 for day 3 of the case of Kowalke against Eastman. Definitely of interest for everybody out there. Our republic, our liberties are on the line. Our election should be determined by the ballot, not the bench. Please like and share.
Please be seated. All right, back on record with the parties present. So we have Mr. Cryer, Mr. Earl here on Zoom. Whenever you're ready, just
Thank you. Mr. Cryer, you've not actually interviewed any other keeper members, have you?
Not to my knowledge, no.
To your knowledge, you've never even spoken with another keeper, have you?
I can't recall any individual that self-identified as no keeper to me that I may have spoken to.
No further questions, I'll ask the witness.
Mr. David, can you be heard?
Very brief, Your Honor. Mr. Kleiner, can you still hear me okay?
I can, but the feedback is quite intense. I'm not sure what the...
Let's have everyone that's on the Zoom, make sure they mute themselves if they don't need to talk.
And I think I pushed my computer on the table and that might have caused feedback. I apologize for that. I only have a few questions, Mr. Kreiner. I want to start with the emails that Mr. Miller asked you about. Do you know what emails specifically to Mr. Eastman or Representative Eastman that you reviewed as part of your work on this case?
I can't speak to any specific ones in terms of like titling numbers saying what they are. They'd just be the ones provided in discovery.
So if you can look at Exhibit 6, Plaintiffs Exhibit 6.
Yes.
Is that one of the emails that you reviewed?
Yes, it is.
If you go to Exhibit 7, Exhibit 7 is an email chain about membership renewal between the Oath Keepers and Representative Eastman, is that another one of the emails that you reviewed?
Yes, it is.
If you can go to Exhibit 14.
Okay.
And that's a call to action email that was sent to Representative Eastman on January 4th. Did you review that one?
I did, yes.
And you testified that you have also, in your work on the Oath Keepers, seen some other emails sent out by the Oath Keepers to membership.
I have, yes.
Do you have any way of knowing whether the emails that are included as exhibits are all of the emails that were ever sent from the Oath Keepers to Representative Eastman?
No, I have no way of knowing that.
Do you have any way of knowing whether the other emails that you reviewed outside of your work on this case constitute all of the emails that were ever sent by the Oath Keepers to membership?
I have no way of affirming that they were all emails sent.
You testified on cross-examination that when Rhodes spoke to InfoWars and other media outlets, it was, I don't want to misquote you, but I think you said functionally the same as sending an email to membership. Did I quote you right?
That's close enough, yes. That is the way that I view it.
And can you explain why you view it that way?
Yes, because I basically lump these into the same categorization of communications because it comes from the leader of the organization in terms of understanding how an organization operates of this nature of extremist or anti-government or whatever you want to, what label you want to give it. When you're engaging in this capacity as leader, what you state as the helm of that entity is equivalent to formal communication, and thus it becomes a direct comparison to any formal communications that come out in print through formal newsletter type distributions, which is what these emails would have represented.
And is that form of communication where a leader will release statements through media outlets, is that a common form of communication by leaders of other violent extremist groups?
Yes, in terms of both statements to press or to favorable outlets, even through social media platforms, these are all common tactics and typically utilize pathways of communicating to their audience, which would either be membership or those that are sympathetic and sometimes even perceived or real enemies of those organizations.
And I think your testimony was that up until some point in time when the Oath Keepers was deplatformed, they also used social media outlets to communicate with members?
That is correct.
And what social media did they use?
They predominantly utilized Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, though Twitter was, I believe, from what I recall reviewing, that was mostly Mr. Rhodes' communications, not necessarily the organization, though there's very little distinction in my mind.
And you said that was on Twitter?
Yes, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook in terms of social media.
No, what I'm trying to pin down is that on Twitter, the page was for Rhodes and not Oath Keepers?
The content that I predominantly reviewed was Mr. Rhodes' Twitter account, yes. Though I do believe they held a formal Twitter account as well.
Okay, and then the Facebook account, was that an Oath Keepers account?
It was.
And approximately how many followers did it have?
Before it went offline, I think it had somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000. The estimations are vary depending on where you look and what time, but that number is about what I recall it being.
Okay, and can you tell the court why, or before I ask you the why, can you tell the court when the Facebook page for Oath Keepers was deplatformed, or if that's the right verb to use?
I don't recall the exact date. I'd have to refer back to my provided statements to give you that date. But in terms of the verb, it would be removed rather than deplatformed.
Okay, removed. So was it close in time to the November 2020 election without giving us an exact date?
It would have been within a year of that, I believe.
And do you know why the Oath Keepers page was removed?
So the statements that were provided from Facebook were that the organization effectively had engaged in sustained violative conduct and therefore had risen to the point of being no longer a viable presence in their estimation on the platform. So they removed it for its conduct that intersected with the platform. And in my professional assessment of how these types of removals tend to work, and the statements that these companies have made, social media companies in general, there is a considerable amount of evaluation that goes into that. And so even though there may be a paltry or simple statement that it was violative in nature, there is a large-scale assessment of those entities as that goes into that decision. And Oath Keepers would have gone through a rigorous evaluation of their rhetoric on the platform and how they behaved off the platform to determine if there was a nexus between, and that would have factored in. And based on their removal, I would say that Facebook came to the conclusion that there was a nexus between their online rhetoric and their offline behaviors that were violative and concerning in a violent nature for the platform.
And if an individual was a follower of the Oath Keepers Facebook page, would they know that the page was removed?
It's very likely that they would have known. It was a fairly high-profile removal, and the organization talked about it quite extensively.
Judge, I want to object on the rest of this is speculative.
Well,
Does he have you can argue if he has a basis of knowledge for why Facebook removed it. Find out.
well, are we going back on the prior test? Because my question now is, how would a person know that Facebook was removed?
Well, I'm speaking to his lad, so as to not interrupt the witness. And perhaps I should be a little more aggressive in my objections, but he slipped in that, they were removed for violence, even though his earlier testimony was that it was based upon his generalized knowledge of why Facebook deplatforms people. And so on that basis, it was speculative. To be consistent with his earlier testimony as to why he knew that was part of the basis for deplatforming.
I understand the point that was made about the earlier testimony. I understand though the current question now is how would someone know that it was removed from Facebook? Do you have an objection to that question?
Well, I mean, if he's got a basis of knowledge to know how.
We'll find out.
I guess we find out through Foundation. So I'll object on Foundation, let him inquire into that, and then I'll go from there.
Well, I can, just to be on the safe side, I'll go back and address some of the other points too. So, Mr. Kreiner, first of all, when you wrote an expert report in this case, did you address the fact that the Oath Keepers had been removed from Facebook and other social media?
I believe it was included, but I have to double check. It's been a while since I wrote it.
And in your study of domestic violent extremist groups, is that an issue that you've looked at previously as to groups being removed for violating Facebook policies?
Yes, not just Facebook, but other social media platforms. It's part of my duties at CTEC.
And why is that included as part of your duties?
The nature of violent extremist activity today is such that individuals do not just solely exist in the real world. They exist as an online persona and utilize digital environments in order to propagate their views, recruit, find like-minded individuals, organize mobilizations offline, mobilize activities online. Therefore, their online activities are fully within the remit of evaluating the organization as a whole.
And so have you become personally familiar with the removal policies of Facebook?
Amongst all other social media platforms, yes, that is true.
And when you say all social media platforms, are you including Twitter and Instagram?
Yes.
And YouTube?
Yes.
And besides the Oath Keepers, have other domestic violent extremist groups been removed from social media for violating policies?
Absolutely. It's the entirety of many teams within these companies, trust and safety divisions, is geared towards evaluating whether or not actors are exploiting their platforms capabilities and services in order to engage in untoward or violative behaviors both on and off platform, and whether or not that provides a risk to that platform's brand, to their users, and to the public writ large.
And does Facebook have a specific policy that's geared towards domestic violent extremist groups?
I'm not familiar with the specifics of their policies. I'm only familiar with, internally, I'm only familiar with what they've put out publicly. What I can say, though, is that they have long viewed militarized social movements as a concerning space for them to evaluate in terms of whether or not entities and individuals, that's why they have a team called Dangerous Orgs and Individuals, excuse me, should or should not be permitted to utilize their platform. And again, as I stated, what they're evaluating is the aggregate of that presence as a net negative and a danger to others, both in terms of direct online to online communications and harassment potential in any other type of digital exploitation, as well as the potential for that to spiral out or incite or encourage or even inspire offline violence in their own membership or even in other people.
And Judge, this is a good break for me to just interject another objection. I mean, if he does not have specific knowledge about why Oath Keepers is the platform, it doesn't matter about his generalized knowledge about the reasons as to why Facebook or Twitter may be platform a particular group. So I think we maybe resolve this issue with that single question as to whether or not he specifically knows the reason.
Mr. Dugan, does he know the reason?
I will ask him, but...
We've laid a foundation for why he would have knowledge in this area now.
So, Mr. Kreiner, I don't know if you heard the dialogue amongst counsel and the court, but do you know the specific reason why Oath Keepers was removed from Facebook?
No one other than those that chose the internal decision as Facebook would have that specific reasoning, but what I know from an expert of evaluating these cases is that the only way.
Hold on, Mr. Kreiner, there's an objection.
Yeah, so, Your Honor, the objection, I mean, he doesn't have adequate foundation to opine on specifically why they're deplatformed. I mean, he's going to offer this generalized assessment based upon what he knows about violent extremist groups and how they normally get deplatformed. That's not useful to the court, Your Honor, and I think it's prejudicial too, for that matter.
And I would also sustain the objection at this point.
Mr. Kreiner, you also testified about instances where an individual Oath Keeper member went, I think the words you used were too far, and the organization made it known that they disagreed with the actions of that individual. Can you give us a couple of examples of that?
Yes, so there was a few individuals that
I'm going to object outside the scope. I mean, I really don't mind the testimony, to be honest with you, but it is outside the scope of my cross.
Overruled because there was testimony that was brought up on cross-examination about specific instances and how much control Mr. Rhodes had over the organization. It's fair response to that on redirect.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Kreiner, you can answer the question.
Do you remember my question, Mr. Kreiner?
yes, but could you just repeat it just so I have it fresh?
Yeah. So when you were being questioned by Mr. Miller, there was dialogue about instances where an individual member of Oath Keepers went, I think the words you used were too far, and the national organization made it known that they disagreed with those individual actions. And I'm asking you to provide a few examples, or a couple or one, or however many you have of that happening.
Yes, so there are two examples that I can bring up off the top of my mind. There's more that I've included in my statement, but the two that I can think of now are Mr. Ritzheimer, an individual that participated in the Mueller refuge standoff. He was rebuked and then later himself ripped up his membership and then earned a response from Mr. Rhodes via YouTube where he made a public statement about Mr. Ritzheimer's behavior is not conforming with the expectations of the organization, and stating that he was a prior, had a criminal record and wasn't to be trusted, and it couldn't be viewed positively within the organization itself. Excuse me. And as such, he utilized that YouTube platform to talk about how that individual went too far, that wasn't what they wanted. A second good example of that is Charles Dyer. Mr. Dyer was an active duty military individual at the time of his association with the Oath Keepers. He was later sort of semi-disavowed by Mr. Rhodes to media when media inquired about Mr. Dyer's association. Mr. Dyer had been regularly talking to journalists. There's a couple of interviews of his that are still publicly available online, whether it's on YouTube or elsewhere, where he explicitly talks about acting as a recruiter for the organization. Later on, Mr. Dyer was criminally charged and found guilty of various different offenses, including having specific types of firearms that were illegal, child sexual abuse, and I believe there were a couple other charges thrown in there as well. But ultimately that earned him he's not fully a member type treatment from Mr. Rhodes, but Mr. Rhodes was very clear that he did not see Mr. Dyer fitting into the organization, though he didn't use any particular language about how he never no longer found them associated with the organization. He just simply stated they are no longer a part of the organization.
Since the events of January 6th, do you have any information of any public statements issued by the Oath Keepers organization disavowing the conduct of Stuart Rhodes?
I do not know of any such statements.
Do you have any knowledge of statements from the organization disavowing the actions of Kelly Meggs?
I do not.
Do you know of any statements from the organization disavowing the actions of the 3 Oath Keepers who pleaded guilty to seditious conspiracy charges?
I do not.
Do you happen to know how many board members the Oath Keepers has?
I cannot recall this exact number off the top of my head.
Do you happen to know if there are currently any board members who are not incarcerated?
I believe there are some, yes.
And to your knowledge, has any board member who is not currently incarcerated issued a statement disavowing the conduct of Rhodes, Meggs, or any of the other Oath Keepers who have pleaded guilty for their conduct on January 6th?
Objection calls for speculation. The witness has already said he doesn't know the names of the people that may or may not be board members who may or may not be incarcerated.
You can answer the specific question. So this question's overruled, but you've largely covered the subject.
Do you want me to repeat?
I'm not aware of any statements.
Okay. Finally, do you recall having a conversation with Mr. Miller a few minutes ago about Representative Eastman's knowledge of certain Oath Keepers' conduct and ideologies?
Yes.
And you remember talking to him about what Representative Eastman may have known and when he may have known about it?
Yes.
Is that something you were asked to address in your expert report in this case?
No.
Is that something that you were asked to study as part of your consulting and expert report writing in this case?
No.
And so any information that you testified to, is that stuff that you incidentally found in conducting your study of the other issues you testified about?
Correct.
I have nothing further.
Any reason we shouldn't excuse Mr. Kreiner for today?
None from defense.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Kreiner, for being available. You may be excused.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kreiner.
Mr. Dugan, who's the next plaintiff's witness?
So, Your Honor, if I could take up a couple housekeeping matters with you, and they're kind of related, but one has to do with the issues you identified this morning. I want to make sure on the second issue, I want to make sure I have it down exactly right. So if you could please say it again.
Sure. So the second issue, I asked the parties to weigh in on, is something more than mere membership required by the First Amendment, the 14th Amendment, or other sections of the Alaska Constitution? And that question's in context with the first question that I had asked regarding the original meaning of the Article 12, Section 4. So to elucidate the second question, basically, is I earlier had ruled that association for an unprotected purpose is not protected, and that was consistent with the case law presented by the parties. But my question now is, what about association for ostensibly protected purpose, but if an organization also has other aims? In other words, does there need to be some sort of nexus or connection that's required by some provision of the United States Constitution or portions of the Alaska Constitution between the association and the prohibited conduct or speech, or the unprotected conduct or speech?
So a nexus between the organization and the...
Between the association by the member and the unprotected conduct. And this question should be understood within as interrelated or as additive to the first question that I asked about. Are we still at least on record?
We are on the record, yes. We are just not on, nor the live stream.
All right, I'm going to wait to answer because we're not on the Zoom or live stream, so it's the video's not here probably. Let's go off record now.
We're back on record.
All right, we're back on record. Ms. Harrison, are you still able to hear us?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. The audio cut out just as you had finished saying, does there need to be a nexus between the members' association and the unprotected conduct?
And so basically the only thing I said after that when the phone line went down or the outside connection went down was essentially that should be read in conjunction or as additive to the first question about what's really the meaning of an original understanding of Article 12, Section 4. You know, is it really just mere membership is enough under that provision? And then the follow-up question then is the second one. Mr. Dedukian, does that make it more clear?
Yes, Your Honor, that was generally what I had, but I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything important.
Mr. Miller, any questions based on that?
None, Judge.
All right. Ms. Harrison, since I've said more words, I just want to make sure it's clear to you what I'm asking for.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor.
My second issue, Your Honor, is that we intend to call Representative Eastman as part of our case in chief to establish membership. However, I would ask that we defer that until tomorrow morning because I want to make sure I can incorporate the court's recent comments into our outline. So if the court would accommodate that, I would appreciate it.
Judge, could we be heard on that?
Certainly.
We would strongly object to that. This case is moving, I know we lost today on Monday. We've been put under the gun like, no, in my entire, I've been in 4 decades of practice. I've never gone through an accelerated trial like this in the history of my practice of law. And I mean, we've jumped through hoops like none other in this case, including the review, I think you saw, Your Honor, in one of our pleadings, 300,000 pages of documents for discovery purposes, including the production of 30,000 pages, I think. And with respect to the discovery order, and this is because of the time that this case was filed. I know that I'm not trying to re-argue that, but at least part of this case was squarely within the control of Mr. Kowalke, at least since the leak of the membership list last fall. Our position is we need to move this along. We're moving into Christmas break, obviously. We potentially have a lot of witnesses. A lot of it is going to depend upon whether or not the jails are cooperative with us, because there are several witnesses that are incarcerated right now that we're going to bring in, that we intend to bring in. But I think we need to use the time. And again, we'd object to starting our case because there's going to be a motion that I make after the conclusion of their case. But he's had a lot of time to think about the questions for Representative Eastman. He's ready to sit on the stand and answer those questions so that their case can be closed.
So what I'm gonna say is, let's move on and start, but if the issues that I raised mid-trial cause you to need to have additional direct, I would grant that, because then we're at least making use of this court time, but I also know I raised some issues mid-trial that parties potentially didn't realize they needed to address, so.
In line with that, though, you're going to, if there is some follow-on questions, you're going to require that tomorrow morning. Because Your Honor, I don't want to start until they've concluded their case.
Will you be ready? The request was for tomorrow morning,
Right.
is what I understood. And so that's as long as I would allow it. You know, if for some reason we're done before the end of the day, I think it would be fair to allow them to ask additional questions after a night.
Okay.
And, I mean, I don't think my questions for Representative Eastman as of now would last more than 15 or 20 minutes.
Good.
Okay. All right, are you otherwise prepared to go forward then?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Miller?
Sure, and would you like to remain seated here, Judge, or it's kind of an informal process with the video anyway, is fine to remain seated next to
I can't
you?
really see him.
Let's have him come up to the witness stand.
Very well.
I certainly take your point, and in some ways it's easier for me to see him, but I think it's fair for opposing counsel to be able to see the witness. Representative Eastman, before you sit down, could you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm that the statements you will provide in today's hearing are the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? All right, please be seated. And once you're seated there, could you please tell us both your first and last name and spell both for us?
David, D-A-V-I-D, Eastman, E-A-S-T-M-A-N.
Just go ahead and pull the microphone right up to you.
And to project and enunciate, please.
Mr. Dickey, may I go ahead?
Thank you. Is the mic picking me up?
The mic is picking you up much better there than it was.
I think that's the mic.
I have swapped it out.
Okay. Representative Eastman, you're a founding lifetime member of the Oath Keepers, correct?
If by Oath Keepers you mean the group that I first investigated in 2009, based on their bylaws and their mission statement to uphold the Constitution, then yes, I am.
By Oath Keepers, sir, I mean the organization that's been incorporated in Nevada with the name Oath Keepers. Are we on the same page with that?
Yeah, I was not aware of their incorporation status or their status as a legal entity when I joined. That wasn't why I joined. I joined because of their mission and the oath that they promote and encourage others to uphold, and the fact that I had previously taken that oath and intend to continue to be bound by that oath.
And Your Honor, if you can instruct the witness, I didn't ask you why you joined, sir. I just asked you if you're a founding lifetime member of the Oath Keepers.
Judge?
And Mr. Miller, he did go beyond the scope of the question. Mr. Dugan, you can continue. Representative Eastman, if you could just focus on answering the question that's been asked of you, your counsel's going to get a chance to do any redirect or rewriting cross, essentially, if there's anything else you need to say.
And Judge, I mean, I could have objected. Because the organizational structure of Oath Keepers is at issue in this case, and it's not a clear-cut answer. And I don't think Representative Eastman is trying to be evasive. I mean, I think he's trying to explain. He's heard all this testimony. He's heard from the experts. He knows what's at issue in this case. And so I think he's trying as best as he can to answer the question.
Understood, Mr. Miller. We're going to move on.
Understood.
Sir, have you ever emailed with anybody at the Oath Keepers?
I have had some emails based on ordering, I think at the very beginning in 2009 or 10, I had purchased a t-shirt and that kind of thing. I think there might have been an email involved with that. I don't remember if that was all just through the website or if there was an email involved with that. But there was also discussed earlier the question of whether or not my membership had expired, and there was an email exchange there as well.
Do you recall emailing with somebody named Rich Melville in June of 2018?
If that's the email I was recalling, then yes. Otherwise, I don't know the context.
Do you recall emailing with someone named Rich Melville?
I don't remember that name, sorry.
Do you recall emailing with anyone who represented themselves to be the national membership coordinator for the Oath Keepers?
I think that would have been that same email I was just referring to.
To make sure we're on the same page, and Madam Clerk, can I get the exhibit folder?
You may approach.
Can you please turn to Exhibit 7 in that binder?
Yes,
Do you recognize that document?
I do, yes.
Can you describe what that document is?
At the beginning, it's a membership email, says it's from Rich Melville, says, sorry about that, David, I'm not sure why my eyes sometimes miss. Founding lifetime member, I guess they're blurred sometimes, thanks for everything. Best regards, Rich Melville, Oath Keepers National Membership Coordinator.
And do you see that the entity that sent that email is listed as Oath Keepers Memberships?
Yes.
So when I refer to Oath Keepers, that's the entity that I'm referring to. Can we agree to that?
Okay.
And it was addressed to you, David Eastman. Is that an email address that you've used,
Yes.
david.eastman@gmail.com?
It is.
And looking at that email now, do you recall emailing with somebody named Rich Melville?
Yes.
And do you see that he has signed the email as National Membership Coordinator for Oath Keepers?
Yes.
And it looks like at least the Oath Keepers characterized you as a founding lifetime member, correct?
Yes.
Move for the admission of Exhibit 7.
No objection.
All right, Exhibit 7 is admitted.
So to provide some context on this email, you received, well, we'll come back to it. You first became a member of the Oath Keepers in January of 2010, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And you paid $103 to the Oath Keepers for membership and some merchandise, correct?
That sounds correct.
And the merchandise had the Oath Keepers logo, correct?
Yes.
And you still have that merchandise somewhere.
I believe so, yeah.
And then in January of 2011, you decided to renew your membership by paying an additional $30, correct?
Correct.
Your initial membership was for 1 year, correct?
I believe so, for $30, I think.
And then you renewed for another year for another $30, correct?
Correct.
Can you turn to Exhibit 3?
Yes.
That's the Oath Keepers membership certificate that you received when you signed up for the organization, correct?
Yes.
And it's signed by Stuart Rhodes?
Yes.
And it says under his signature that he's the founder of the Oath Keepers?
Yes.
And you still have that certificate since you provided it to us, correct?
I do.
Move for the admission of Exhibit 3.
No objection.
All right, Exhibit 3 is admitted.
Can you look at Exhibit 4?
Representative Eastman, could you just make sure that when you're giving answers, it's just for the sake of our recording, that it's a little bit louder and a little bit more clear?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's the mic, Judge. I'm picking it up on my, it's kind of a hollow, tinny sound, and I'm not sure.
I agree, just make sure you're nice and close. It's probably the mic. I can hear him, but it's.
I'll swap the mics out again to see if
Are you at Exhibit 4, sir?
Yes.
What is that?
This is a document that came with the certificate that I received when I first joined Oath Keepers.
Okay, it's a letter from Stuart Rhodes.
Yes, it is.
At the top where it has the address, it says Oath Keepers and provides a Las Vegas address, correct?
It does, yes.
And again, just to avoid any confusion, anytime I refer to the Oath Keepers, I'm referring to that organization listed on this letter, okay? Okay?
Okay. Go ahead.
The letter says that the Oath Keepers are counting you as an official member of the Oath Keepers, correct?
Yes.
Move for the admission of Exhibit 3.
Exhibit 4?
I'm sorry, 4, correct?
No objection, Judge.
All right, Exhibit 4 is admitted.
So you paid your initial membership fee in 2010, then renewed in 2011, and then sometime around 2014, they started offering lifetime memberships, correct?
I think actually, in looking, sometime after I received that first membership is when they were offered lifetime memberships. I'm not sure exactly when that was, but I think it was before 2014. I think my membership lapsed after I renewed the first time.
But in 2014, you decided you were going to become a lifetime member of the organization?
Yes, I did.
When you signed up for the Oath Keepers, you got access to the Oath Keepers forum, correct?
Yes,
And you had a username on that forum, correct?
I did.
And at some point, you also joined the Oath Keepers Facebook page, correct?
I think there was an informal Facebook page for Alaska that was called Oath Keepers, but I don't think it was run by the organization or it was limited to Oath Keepers members. I think they just sort of had that name informally.
Do you remember the name of the Facebook page?
I think it probably said something along the lines of Alaska Oath Keepers or Oath Keepers in Alaska or Oath Keepers for Alaska or something like that. I know it had Alaska and Oath Keepers in the name.
Were you ever a follower of the main Oath Keepers Facebook page?
I don't believe so, no.
You received from time to time emails that were sent from the Oath Keepers to membership, correct?
I did.
And I believe you testified at your deposition you also received some flyers in the mail?
Yes, there was once I got some flyers or bumper sticker or something from Oath Keepers. I'm not sure exactly when that was.
So at some point after you initially signed up, the organization started offering lifetime memberships. And then in 2014, you decided to sign up for a lifetime membership, correct?
Yes.
And if you can turn to Exhibit 5. Do you recognize that?
It appears to be an email receipt for when I started the lifetime membership. I set up for recurring payments that were automatic.
So
Counsel, if you could, are you having a look at the entire exhibit or just the front page?
he can look at as much of it as he wants to.
Judge, I just want to make sure that the witness understands that there are 40 pages to this or so.
Oh, okay, didn't realize that. Looks like 44 pages.
Let the record reflect that you looked at every page of that document, correct?
Yes,
And every page of that document has a Bates number that starts with a DCE, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And this is a document that you produced to us in Discovery, correct?
Correct.
And this is a document showing the payment plan you set up to become a lifetime member of the Oath Keepers,
Yes.
right? And so the entire lifetime membership cost you $1,000, right?
Correct.
And you set it up through monthly PayPal payments of $50 per month, correct?
I didn't set it up personally, but whatever the option was on the Oath Keepers website, I just checked the monthly payment option. The rest was automatic.
And if you can turn to DCE 41, that reflects a final payment of September 28, 2015, correct?
Correct.
And when you, first of all, move for the admission of Exhibit 5.
No objection.
Right, Exhibit 5 is admitted.
When you became a lifetime member of the Oath Keepers, you received a separate certificate for that, correct?
I believe so. I haven't seen it in many years, if so.
And so in September of 2015, you were fully paid up for your lifetime membership. But then in the email we were looking at in Exhibit 5, or sorry, which email was it? Exhibit 7, if you can go back to Exhibit 7, which is already in evidence. So you paid up, you were fully paid up by September of 2015, and then in June of 2018, you received an email from Rich Melville saying that your membership had expired, correct?
Correct.
And how did you respond to that?
Let's see, which exhibit is that? Is that 7?
7.
I just responded with a one-line response from my cell phone, and I just said, how does a lifetime or a life membership expire? It said there.
So by sending that message, you were expressing an intention to stay as a lifetime member of the Oath Keepers, correct?
I don't think that was the issue for me. What I was simply wanting to know is, why are you trying to get more money out of me for a lifetime membership if I already paid it several years before at that point?
Okay. And then in response to your inquiry, that's when Mr. Melville confirmed to you that you were a founding lifetime member, correct?
Correct.
And sitting in court today, you're still a member of the Oath Keepers, right?
Like I said a minute ago, or started to say, the organization that I joined in 2009, yes, I intended to join, and that was the choice that I would make again for the same reasons. But to the extent that there's this other parallel organization that I didn't join and that has a different mission than the one that I signed up for, I'm not a member of that organization.
So, sir, I'm just talking about the organization that you joined in 2009 that was founded by Stuart Rhodes, okay? And that organization has a number of board members, correct?
I believe so. I don't have the number.
Right, but you know who some of them are, right?
I've never interacted with any of the board members.
No, haven't you sent letters to some of the board members?
I've tried to reach out. I have never had a response from anyone.
Okay, but you did recently try to communicate with several of the board members, correct?
I did send an email, yes, and some letters.
Your Honor, may I approach again and get the other exhibit finder?
Yes.
Can you turn to Exhibit Z?
Yes.
Exhibit Z contains some emails and letters that you sent out in late November, correct?
Correct.
And so, for example, Exhibit Z, page 1, is an email that you sent to an R. Twitchell.
Correct.
And what is your understanding of who R. Twitchell is?
I was told that the names and addresses here were current board members of the Oath Keepers, and so I contacted everyone that I could find an email address or a mailing address or a potential email address or potential mailing address. I did not receive any responses, so I don't know if they received my messages or not. But I did my due diligence to reach out and see if I could have that conversation.
Right, so the people that were included on the mailing list, for example, on Exhibit Z, page 2, they're all individuals you understood to be board members of the Oath Keepers that you joined in 2009, not a parallel organization.
I believe so, yes.
And all of these individuals, to your knowledge, are not currently incarcerated, correct?
I wasn't aware of whether they were incarcerated or not, but since the addresses don't go to jails, I would assume they're not incarcerated.
And what was your purpose in sending these communications?
I think I sent the same question to each individual, and it was basically that I had seen in the news about the conviction of Stuart Rhodes and other Oath Keepers for felonies, and my reading of the bylaws is that no one who has been convicted of a felony can be a member of Oath Keepers, so I wanted to ask, if they read that the same way, and if that was, if Stuart Rhodes was no longer a member of the organization, or if they were in the process of making that the case. But my purpose was just, is this the same organization that I joined with the bylaws, or, or someone had alleged in this case that the bylaws were meaningless or they weren't being followed. So my question is to the point of, are these still the bylaws? Are they being followed? I'd like to know, obviously, bylaws are important to me. It's the backbone of an organization. If the organization isn't, connected with its bylaws anymore, then it's not the organization that I joined.
Right. And so, sitting here in court today, you're still a member of the Oath Keepers, right?
I believe so. I've not heard from anyone in Oath Keepers about my membership since the email, I think, in 2018, so
Right.
several years.
You have not made any public statement that maybe I didn't see, where you said, I'm hereby resigning or renouncing my membership in the Oath Keepers.
I have not made such a statement.
And you have not sent any communication looking a lot like these communications, but saying, dear Oath Keepers, please remove me from your membership list, or I'm resigning my membership in the Oath Keepers, correct?
Correct.
And when I spoke with you about a month ago, at that point, you said you hadn't made a final decision if you were going to leave the organization or not, correct?
I don't remember the particulars of that conversation. I think the question had something to do about indictments, and at that time, I recognized that indictment's important, but people are innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
Particularly an organization, if an organization is being charged with a crime, it's innocent until proven guilty. I think that was the context in that, and so for that reason, I wouldn't make it a decision just based on something that I didn't have personal knowledge of, or something that's just been
Right.
alleged or charged.
And at the time, you said that one of the things that would determine if you would stay in the organization or not is whether they would enforce their bylaws, correct?
Correct.
And since that time, Stuart Rhodes and Kelly Meggs were convicted of seditious conspiracy charges, right?
Correct.
And even before that time, 3 other Oath Keepers had pleaded guilty to seditious conspiracy charges, correct?
Correct.
And other Oath Keepers had pleaded guilty to other conspiracy charges, right?
Correct.
And so after the jury verdict came down on Stuart Rhodes, and you sent this communication to the Oath Keepers on November 30th, have you received any information to suggest that Stuart Rhodes and Kelly Meggs have been removed from the organization?
I would say I don't believe the bylaws have changed, so I don't believe that they would be members of the organization at this point.
That wasn't my question, sir. My question was, did you receive any indication from the Oath Keepers that Stuart Rhodes and Kelly Meggs have been removed from the organization?
I haven't received any communication from the Oath Keepers in over a year, probably closer to 18 months at this point.
In your communication to the Oath Keepers, your question was, does the conviction of Rhodes for 2 felonies preclude, and I think you only mentioned Rhodes by name, but then you say, does this preclude those members of Oath Keepers who were convicted yesterday from continuing to serve as members and leaders of Oath Keepers, right? That was your question.
Correct.
and you haven't received anything to suggest that they're no longer members.
I haven't received anything one way or the other.
You have studied the bylaws of the Oath Keepers, right?
I've read them.
Okay. You've read them, and you probably saw that Stuart Rhodes is considered the founder for life of the organization.
I'm not familiar with that specific provision.
Okay, maybe I can direct you to it. Can you turn to Exhibit U?
Yes.
So do you see in section 1.05 it defines the founder as E. Stuart Rhodes?
Yes.
And then do you see in section 2.01 that it says that the board of the Oath Keepers shall consist of a founder and at least 10 additional trustees for so long as the founder is living, is not incompetent, and has not resigned. The founder shall be absolutely entitled to serve as a trustee of Oath Keepers and chairman of the board. Do you see that?
Yes.
And have you seen language in the bylaws that gives the founder veto power over board actions?
Not familiar with that, but it might be there.
Okay. So have you seen any indication that Stuart Rhodes has resigned from the Oath Keepers?
No.
Have you seen any indication that the organization has deemed him to be incompetent?
No.
And you didn't get any kind of response from the Oath Keepers to your inquiry saying that they were enforcing the bylaws and removing him, right?
Not yet.
Okay. And so in that letter you sent out 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
Okay, like that is correct?
Which exhibit was that? I'd go
It
back
was
and look
Z.
at the date.
Exhibit Z.
Okay.
If you look on Exhibit Z, page 1, it says Wednesday, November 30th. right?
Yes, it does.
And you requested a response by Friday, which would have been December 2nd.
Yes.
And now it's been almost, actually, it's been exactly 2 weeks since you sent your inquiry, and you haven't received any kind of verification from the Oath Keepers that these individuals have been removed. But yet, sitting here today in court, you still have not determined to resign the organization, correct?
Correct?
How come you didn't send an email or a letter to the board when the individuals pled guilty to seditious conspiracy charges months ago?
Objection, beg. What individuals are you referring to?
Just clarify that.
Sir, were you aware that certain individuals pled guilty to seditious conspiracy? Certain Oath Keepers pled guilty to...
I believe so, yes.
And are you familiar with the names Joshua James, Brian Ulrich, and Brian Todd Wilson? Or I may have the first name wrong. But Wilson, James, and Ulrich, are you familiar with those names?
No, not really.
But you were aware when we spoke about a month ago that some individuals had indeed pleaded guilty to seditious conspiracy who were Oath Keepers, right?
Yes.
And yet, despite that knowledge, at that time you hadn't sent any communication asking if those individuals were going to be removed, correct?
Correct?
In October of 2021, you spoke with journalist James Brooks about your Oath Keepers membership, correct?
I don't remember the specific communication. Do you have it here on the exhibit?
I don't have it as an exhibit, it was admitted in the answer, and I can point you to that, but I'm going to read you the code instead.
Sure.
At the time, you said, I joined the Oath Keepers when it first started and will always consider it a privilege to stand with those in the military and first responders who strive to keep their oaths to the Constitution. You admit to making that statement, correct?
Yes.
That statement was made in October of 2021, well after the events of January 6, 2021.
Yes.
You were aware that Stuart Rhodes participated in the insurrection on January 6, 2021, correct?
Not particularly.
Well, you became aware when he was indicted and arrested, right?
Indicted and arrested for insurrection, you said?
For seditious conspiracy.
Okay. I'm familiar, he was convicted of seditious conspiracy.
You were aware, well, let me back up and ask you the question a few different ways. you were aware that Stuart Rhodes was at the Capitol building on January 6, 2021, correct?
Not at the time, no.
No, but you were aware when you spoke with journalist Brooks that he was at the Capitol building on January 6th.
I believe so. I don't know about the particulars of where he was.
And Judge, that mistakes the testimony so far. I mean, we've objected all the hearsay testimony anyway, that where he was actually outside of the Capitol. Stuart Rhodes has never been alleged to have been within the Capitol or even at the Capitol. I mean, I know we're talking about distinctions of geography, but.
With that, I understood the question to just be in the vicinity of the Capitol. I didn't understand it as being inside of it, but the testimony will speak for itself there. But Mr. Deegan, is the question related to, could you clarify when you're asking Representative Eastman that he knew?
I'll clear it up. At some point, sir, did you become aware that Stuart Rhodes was in the vicinity of the Capitol building on January 6th?
Within the District of Columbia.
So as sitting in court today, your awareness is that he was somewhere within the District of Columbia on January 6th?
I believe so.
You have no stance on whether he was at the Capitol, in the vicinity of the Capitol building on
I
January 6th?
don't have any personal knowledge.
Okay. You became aware at some point that that other oath keepers were included in the individuals who breached the Capitol building on January 6th, correct?
Breached the Capitol building? I don't know if that's what they were convicted of.
That's not what I asked, sir. Did you become aware at any point in time that individuals who identified as oath keepers entered the Capitol building on January 6th?
Yes.
And did you become aware that those individuals assembled in military stack formations?
I think some of them did, and I think there was others that did not.
And you saw video footage of that, right?
I've seen some video footage. Might have included that. It probably did, but I couldn't say for sure.
And when you spoke with Mr. Brooks in October 2021, you were aware that a number of oath keepers had been criminally indicted for their conduct on January 6th, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And still at that point, you said that you would always stand with you would always consider it a privilege to stand with the oath keepers, right?
That's not what I told James Brooks at all.
Okay, so what did you admitted in your, let me just read you the quote and tell me if you admit to it or not. Your quote was, "I joined the Oath Keepers when it first started and will always consider it a privilege to stand with those in the military and first responders who strive to keep their oaths to the Constitution."
Correct.
You admit to that quote?
Yes.
And since then, you've been asked by journalists whether you want to give up your membership in the Oath Keepers, and you've consistently said no.
I don't recall any specific conversations.
So even after you became aware of Oath Keepers entering the Capitol building on January 6th, Oath Keepers assembling in military formations, Oath Keepers being charged with conspiracy and other criminal federal charges, and even after Stuart Rhodes was indicted himself and convicted by a DC jury, sitting in court today, you still are not ready to resign from the organization.
You know, there's an awful lot there. I would also include the fact that I knew that there were Oath Keepers who entered the Capitol building on January 6th to help protect Capitol police officers. That was part of my knowledge at the time.
Well, how did you have that knowledge, sir?
From reading and watching video and hearing testimony.
So you had that knowledge from reading and watching video and listening to testimony, but you had no idea where Stuart Rhodes was within the city of DC on January 6th?
I heard something about a hotel, but I don't remember the name.
That's the extent of your knowledge on what Stuart Rhodes did on January 6th.
Pretty much.
But you also know, as a fact, that certain Oath Keepers were in the Capitol helping the police.
Yes.
Can you look at Exhibit 6? There's already been some testimony about it. Do you recognize that email?
I think we were talking about it earlier today or possibly yesterday.
That's an email that was sent to your email address, david.eastman@gmail.com, correct?
Correct.
And it was sent from Stuart Rhodes.
Yes.
And it's an email that you gave to us in discovery.
Yes.
I move for the admission of Exhibit 6.
No objection.
All right, Exhibit 6 is admitted.
Now can you turn to Exhibit 14? Do you recognize Exhibit 14?
I do.
That's another email you got from the Oath Keepers on January 4th, correct?
Correct.
And it's a call to action. Oath Keepers deploying to DC to protect events, speakers, and attendees on January 5 and 6. Time to stand, correct?
Yes.
And again, this is a document that was sent to your personal email and you gave it to us in discovery, right?
Correct.
And after you got this email, you forwarded it to someone named Pat Martin, correct?
Correct.
And then on that same day, you and Mr. Martin flew to Washington, D.C., right?
Correct.
And you and Mr. Martin were at the Capitol building on January 6, 2021.
No.
You were at the Grant Memorial, correct?
Yes.
And that's very close to the Capitol building?
I don't know how to define very close, but I can point you to it on a map.
Okay. Move for the admission of Exhibit 14.
No objection.
All right, Exhibit 14 is admitted.
Exhibit 14 referred to massive vote fraud. Do you see that? It's in the paragraph that starts with, "It is critical."
Okay, yeah, I see that.
And at the time you got this email and traveled to Washington, D.C., you also agreed that there was vote fraud in the election, correct?
I think at the time, my position was that it was clear that there had been laws that had been violated, and an investigation was very appropriate.
And it's clear when you read this email from the Oath Keepers that they believed, at least, that Trump won the election, correct?
Okay, I'll have to look at that.
Well, let me direct you to the language, sir, just to save
Please.
some time.
Go ahead.
Can you look at the top of the second page of the exhibit?
Yes.
Do you see the language where it says, "President, you support him," or, sorry, it starts actually on the page before. It says, "Show the president you support him taking decisive action as both president and commander-in-chief, and show Congress that we the people will not stand for the election being stolen to plant an imposter Chi-Con puppet in the White House."
Yes.
Do you see that? Does that suggest to you that the Oath Keepers believe that Trump won the election?
I think so. It talked about an election being stolen. I think the assumption would be that it was stolen from President Trump. But I also would say that there's another interpretation. It was stolen from the people of the United States.
And you also believe that Trump won the election when you went to Washington, D.C. on January 4th, correct?
Again, I think my position in engaging with others was that it was clear that some things had happened that shouldn't have, and the people deserve to have transparency and a full investigation.
So it wasn't your belief at the time you flew to D.C. that Trump won the election?
I think as a public figure, as a legislator, my duty, my concern is for a process that is lawful and legal. And a legal and lawful process requires that when there are concerns over the legitimacy of an election or whether the vote count was accurate, that there be an audit or other investigation to make sure that the results are actually accurate.
Well, so I'm going to ask the question again because I don't think you've answered it. Did you think that Trump won the election when you traveled to DC on January 4?
I don't remember having a position on that.
Did you think that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself?
Judge.
Well, let me
Hold
ask.
on, I understand the objection. Mr. Dedukian.
I will connect it. It's not really related to Jeffrey Epstein.
I mean, that's far more distant than, you know, the issues that we've already talked about, Judge.
I'm not gonna-
I'm gonna let, he needs to now explain why it's relevant. So, Mr. Dedukian, why is it relevant?
Well, can I back up and ask a different question? Sir, did you author an article called Trump Lost and Jeffrey Epstein Killed Himself?
I did.
And was that title intended sarcastically?
I don't know if sarcastic is the right question. The title was intended to draw a distinction.
So what is the distinction you were trying to draw?
I think the whole article is drawing the distinction between truth and political truth.
Okay, so when you put in the title of the article, Trump lost and Jeffrey Epstein killed himself, were you declaring that Trump did not in fact lose?
What I was declaring, I think if you read the article, it becomes quite clear, is that there are some who say it doesn't matter, and that whether or not Jeffrey Epstein killed himself, whether or not Trump lost and the election was stolen, you are not allowed to question certain things. And I think those are two of the things you're not allowed to question as an American.
Where the email from the Oath Keepers said that the election was being stolen to plant an imposter Chi-Com puppet in the White House, you also believed at the time that our country needed to be wrested back from Chi-Com funded oligarchs, right?
I don't remember holding that belief.
Okay, can I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Even?
This is something new.
Yes,
I mean,
yes, Mr. Miller,
and I'm assuming it
Well, it's
is.
an impeachment document I'm going to show tonight. Sir, this is, I'll represent to you, it's a document that's based stamp DCE 032762. It was produced to us in discovery by you or your attorneys. And it looks to be, and Your Honor, I don't know if you want a copy, I have one if you would like it, or I can just ask the
Are you
witness.
going to mark this just for?
No, I'm not going to mark it.
I would appreciate a copy, so
Okay.
please approach.
May I approach?
Yes.
And Judge, just to help you out with this is part of the discovery that was propounded pursuant to your order. And that is our marking in the bottom right-hand corner.
So, sir, this looks to be a reproduction of text messages that you sent on January 4, sent or received on January 4, 2021.
Yes.
And if you look about a quarter of the way down from the top, you received a text from somebody named Noel -NAGR Former. Do you know who that person is?
I know of him. I shared some text messages with him, generally, yeah.
So who is he?
Objection, Judge, relevancy. The identity of him is not important. It's whether or not there's an affirmation of the statement that Representative Eastman did not remember.
Does the identity of the person matter?
No, not particularly. So. That is, you do admit that that is a person that you texted with.
Correct.
And whoever that person is said, I love Massey at January 4, 9:51 and 20 seconds a.m. sent you a text saying, I love Massey, but at what point do we wrest back our republic, wrest back our republic back from Chi-Com funded oligarchs? And you responded almost instantaneously with saying true. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you agreed with Stuart Rhodes at that time that Chi-Com oligarchs were, I guess, running the country?
No, I wasn't really familiar with Stuart Rhodes' views on that. It was not a term that I would use myself.
Okay, but you said true to it when you got a text saying that.
I did. I wasn't saying that I would use those exact words, though.
Can you look at Exhibit 9? Oh, never mind, I think, well, Your Honor, we filed the stipulation, I think yesterday, and I wanted to ask if the documents attached to it were now admitted or still needed to be admitted.
Pull this up, so we've got, there were 5 exhibits to the stipulation, is that right?
That's not memory, Judge.
And how do they correspond then to the,
They
are they
don't.
essentially the same as 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12?
Unfortunately, the numbers don't match up.
But are they the same set of documents that would be in
Yes.
8, 9, 10, 11, and 12?
Not 8.
Okay.
I think 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13.
Okay.
So I was going to lay foundation for the declaration of candidacy, but if that's admitted, then I don't have to do that.
Judge, it's stipulated. I mean, all the parties, including the state, have stipulated to it, so I don't think we need to go through the time.
I agree, I'm just double checking.
I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page as well.
Yeah.
So if the parties are all in agreement that's already stipulated to, then 9 is admitted.
Now, I will tell you that, I mean, it's relevant to the state, and the state's, the claims against the state. I don't see its relevancy to this witness now, but I guess counsel can explain that.
I just want to make sure it's in evidence, and it is, so I think we don't have to belabor it.
Right.
And Your Honor, I don't have,
Just 9, or is there a stipulation?
Is there-
9 through 13?
Is there also a request for the rest of them to be admitted at this point? Since we're on the subject, we might as well address it.
the rest of the documents attached to the stipulation? Yes, Your Honor, there is.
Okay. Ms. Harrison, I see you out there on Zoom. Any problem with the rest of the documents attached to the stipulation being admitted?
No, Your Honor, that's fine. I did just want to clarify that number 8, I don't think was attached to the stipulation, but I think I heard that said. Also, since I'm here and speaking now, I am hearing from folks that there's a lot of delays and some trickiness happening with the live stream, although it is still up and running, but I just wanted to let you know that, Your Honor.
Thank you, I appreciate that. It sounds like I've been seeing bandwidth errors through the day, and we're also having phone connection issues, I think likely due to the weather that's here in Palmer and around South Central, and so it's unfortunate, but that's the reality, I think, of where we're at communication-wise. But Ms. Harrison, I appreciate the update.
Sure, thank you.
And so we can clean this up on the exact numbers later on. I'd like to get through the witness, but all of the 5 documents attached to the stipulation are admitted into evidence.
And there are a total, Judge, of 86 pages, just so the record's clear. I'm looking at the stipulation now, 86 pages attached to the stipulation.
Representative Eastman, when we were talking about the bylaws, I forgot to ask you, but is it your understanding that the commission of seditious conspiracy would violate the bylaws of the Oath Keepers?
I think that would be a felony, so it would violate the bylaws for someone to be a member and commit that offense.
And did you have an opportunity to review the expert reports in this case?
I don't know that I've read them. I might have, or portions of them.
Were you aware that even before January 6th, several Oath Keepers had been charged and convicted of felony crimes?
I wasn't familiar, no.
And Judge, I guess I'd speak a little bit too. I think it's appropriate to enter an objection with respect to the word that's being tossed around, conviction. Under the federal criminal rules, and I think it's 32K1, conviction is not actually entered until at the time of sentencing. So throwing around this word that they've been convicted because of the jury's verdict, a verdict has been returned, but the conviction is not entered until their sentencing. And at least with respect to Stuart Rhodes, that's a few weeks or months out yet.
Thank you.
Is it your understanding, sir, that a jury verdict for seditious conspiracy would violate the bylaws of the Oath Keepers?
I don't have any particular knowledge of what their bylaws means as far as when the conviction becomes official or how many days the board has to apply, removal of a member. I haven't talked to anyone on that before, so I don't know.
So my question wasn't about how long the board has to act. My question was about the distinction between a jury verdict and a sentencing order or conviction, as your lawyer just stated. So you took the jury verdict. The jury verdict prompted you to communicate with the board and find out if they were going to enforce the bylaws, correct?
Yes.
So you took the jury verdict to be a final determination of their guilt?
No, I understand there's going to be appeals.
Okay. Did you hear the testimony today from the experts about the belief of Oath Keepers that they can refuse to follow a law that they conclude on their own is unconstitutional?
Did I hear the testimony? I heard the testimony, yes.
Yes, and you share that view, right? You also believe that an Oath Keeper can refuse to follow a law that they conclude on their own is unconstitutional.
And Judge, I don't mind the question, but my memory is that's not what the testimony or the questions pertain to. It was an order from somebody as to whether or not that order was constitutional or not. Again, it just misstates the testimony. You can certainly ask the question, but I believe that, at least that's my memory of it. It's not a photographic memory, but.
I'll go back and listen to the testimony.
Fair enough. So I was just asking if you recall that testimony, but here's my question. My question is, isn't it true that you believe that Oath Keepers can refuse to follow a law that they conclude on their own is unconstitutional?
I think anyone who's taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution has a duty to avoid doing anything that would violate the Constitution.
Okay, but that's a little bit different than my question. Did you say at your deposition, quote, Oath Keepers can refuse to follow a law that they conclude on their own is unconstitutional?
Yeah, I'm trying to be accurate in my testimony. If something is unconstitutional, you believe it's unconstitutional, then absolutely you have a right to not do that thing.
Right, and I just want the record to be clear that when you said yeah and agreed with me, you were agreeing that you said those words or agreed to those words at your deposition.
I don't remember the exact words I used.
Okay, Your Honor, perhaps we can try a video share again, or,
I'm confused by the distinction that you're drawing here, Mr. Dugan. Are you trying to get him to say the exact words that he said at his deposition, or to answer the question in general about if that's it?
yeah, so let me ask it again.
But Judge, I object to asking. I mean, he has affirmed the general concept that he's referring to. I think what Representative Eastman has said, look, I just don't remember if these were the exact words.
Okay, if that's what he said, that's fine.
I understood his answer to be an acknowledgement that that's what he believed.
Okay, then, subject to what we discussed earlier and potentially having a few more questions in the morning, I don't have anything more right now.
Understood. We're at about 4:10. We could either essentially go out of order. If you have a few questions you'd like to have at this point, we can make use of this additional 20 minutes of time. If you'd rather wait until after the other party finishes in the morning, that's fine by me.
Your Honor, I so much apologize because I do want the efficiency of the court to be honored, but the reality is I need to wait until after the direct is finished with Representative Eastman.
That's fine. It's 20 minutes before we
Thank you.
Parties tomorrow, I'm going to repeat the same thing I said yesterday as far as, and Mr., you may return. Thank you. We're on my drive in this morning, there was a decent amount of freezing rain coming down. We're got a forecast for about 8 to 12 inches, roughly both between Palmer and Anchorage. Please check early on before you start heading into the courthouse to see whether or not we're open. It's unprecedented that the court system's been closed this much because of weather between the windstorm last year and then the snow event we had this year. But we're in basically a bunch of back-to-back storms at this point. So please do make sure that we're actually open before you head in. If we're not, we are going to try and assemble online. Keep an eye out for emails. My intent would be to try and start at 9 to 9:30 if we are transitioning online, but I understand people have to get to places. It might cause a change in plans. And so we're going to have to be flexible. I'm just asking the parties' indulgence and to stay on top of any flexibility that we need to have.
Great. And Judge, we have access to internet if we have to do it that way, so.
And Your Honor, one other thing, if I can have Mr. Miller identify witnesses for tomorrow, because we've been doing the same, and we're going to be done with our case. So if we get through Representative Eastman, who else would be called?
So Judge, the only one I know for sure is Jon Lewis for tomorrow. The problem is, as I specified this in the final witness list, is that many of these individuals, I mean, assuming that we go into our case tomorrow, I'm going to make an argument at the conclusion that we shouldn't, but assuming that the court directs us in that manner, we do have back witnesses that are incarcerated and we're having difficulty with. So a lot of it's going to depend on a number of emails and texts that I've gotten while we've been sitting here in court, and many of them are in Eastern time. I may not be able to talk to them until the morning. I think the record will reflect that the order of witnesses that I got was the night before this trial was starting. So I'll do the best I can. He knows Jon Lewis is going to be on tomorrow. I probably will put my client on tomorrow as well. And he'll probably be in advance of Jon Lewis, but those are really the only two that I know for sure. The rest are just going to have to play by ear. And Your Honor, again, if we go forward into Representative Eastman's case, we will need to interrupt for some of these witnesses that are fact witnesses that are incarcerated.
I understand that there's challenges that dealt with it myself in getting witnesses in court. And so, you know, we'll be flexible. We got to keep moving forward though. So I'll give you every opportunity to get your witnesses on. But if they become available in the middle of the witness's testimony and you know, we just got a break to take them on, I'm fine with that. We just got to be realistic about getting things done. And I appreciate the professional courtesy between the parties. That's all. Anything else that we need to address today?
No, Judge.
All right, thank you very much. We can stand in recess.
All right, thank you guys all for being here today. This was day 3 of the Kowalke versus Eastman case. Please make sure to like, share, click that notification bell, subscribe, follow, do whatever you need to do to make sure that you never miss a live stream. YouTube is the best folks for being able to make sure you guaranteed to get a notification. Facebook does it when they feel like it. And we are working on our way toward streaming live to Rumble, but it takes 100 subscribers. So if you're on Rumble, or even if you're not on Rumble, please go to Rumble. Make an account. Just subscribe there. The sooner I get to 100 people, the sooner that we can be able to make sure that we are uncancelable by the mainstream media so that we don't have to worry about our videos being shut down or censored. Again, please take the time to like, share this video, and help us out by going to our website at Politadick.com once it's back up and running at the end of the week, and click that support button and show your support. Help us make it to more events like this one so that you can get everything uncut, unfiltered, something our mainstream media refuses to do. Thank you guys all for being here once again today. You guys all have a great afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9.